before you do that,
we're live.
no.
Sorry, David. See, welcome to not Reason Theology, Orthodox Christian Theology.com.
Yeah.
On a Saturday night, which is why we're all not prepared. And David, if you need to walk out for a minute, I will just introduce the show or whatever you need to do, or just go with it.
No, I don't need to. Yeah.
The topic tonight is more of a meta-analysis of the Council of Chalcedon from two divergent viewpoints. Oriental Orthodox, here presented by Subdeacon Daniel Kakish, and the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox side presented by David, the real midway. I'm going to try to not really be a moderator because I obviously have opinions about history, but I'm going to try to be kind of the sort of neutral dude that's going to try to make sure as much as possible both sides get an equal amount of time in this. And I'm also going to try to let David, because this is my channel, if I want to give my opinion, I can do that whenever I want. So I don't always have David here. So this is really going to be more about David, Subdeacon Daniel, unless I really feel like it. But I'm going to try to stay away from that temptation. So I think with this, because it's more of conversation, it's not a debate, I think really what we would need to talk about ultimately is Ephesus 2, right? Because I know both you guys have opinions on Ephesus 2, and that's really the pretext behind Chalcedon, what went down in Chalcedon, the issues that are at issue at Chalcedon. So being that the Ephesus 2 is an ecumenical council that is considered ecumenical by the Oriental Orthodox Communion. I know that Subdeacon Daniel has read the minutes. He's sent me pictures of the minutes of something I was researching. I want to get the ball rolling with you. How about we start with, being that leading to Chalcedon, why do you think whether Chalcedon was inevitable after a council like Ephesus 2, or should have not been, and Chalcedon was a betrayal? Give us your perspective, and I think they'll get the ball rolling in this conversation.
I think that we have to define what are the ingredients of an ecumenical council. So what is an ecumenical council supposed to have? And did Ephesus 2 have those ingredients? I think if we have the same standard, if we have the same measurements on what constitutes an ecumenical council, if we believe that councils in that time and moment can declare themselves to be ecumenical councils, so that's another question. There's the whole, there's the receptive theory and whatnot. So, and there are also for example, Chalcedon, it thought of itself as an ecumenical council. So did Ephesus 2, right? So in the case that Ephesus 2 is making the claim to be an ecumenical council, in the case that the Roman emperor is calling it to be an ecumenical council, enforced its policies as ecumenical council policies, and was the same emperor that also did Ephesus 1, 431. So in all of these situations, you have now everything that constitutes an ecumenical council, except, and this is a matter of opinion. I'm not saying this is my opinion. I'm just saying this is some people's opinion. After the fact, not before, after the fact, the Bishop of Rome rejected it. If the approval of the Bishop of Rome is necessary for a council to be ecumenical after the fact, before the fact, we know he accepted because he sent his representatives there. He knew the council was convening, and he sent his tome to be, in his opinion, an authoritative document. So if the Bishop of Rome's approval after the council is necessary for the council to have ecumenical status, then it's not ecumenical. But if the Bishop of Rome's approval after the fact is not necessary, so then it meets all the other points. If it is now ecumenical, then the question is, I'm glad actually Craig opened up with Ephesus 2, because that's really where the story starts. Or we can even say Constantinople 448 if we want to. And then And then Chalcedon becomes more of a revenge council. To be respectful, like we could be polemical, you know, but in a respectful way, this is Leo's attempt at getting back at Dioscoros for what he feels was the embarrassment that happened to him. Because when Dioscoros actually, when he arrived at Chalcedon, I think 10 days before the council or something like that, he and the Egyptian Synod formally excommunicated Leo. That's when the excommunication of Leo officially happened. But it didn't happen at Ephesus too, intentionally. They intentionally, a lot of scholars say this. I don't know how true it is. I'm not saying it's my opinion, but it's just out there that the tome was not read at Ephesus 2. One of the reasons is because if it had been read, I think Friend also mentions this, and yeah, Friend for sure mentions it in a few writings of his, that that Leo and Rome would have been excommunicated. So in protecting Rome from excommunication, the tome was not read at Ephesus 2. So and it would not have been possible, and I think this is a fair statement to say, it would not have been possible for Chalcedon to have happened regardless of how badly Rome wanted it to happen, because in 449 Rome had a synod in Rome rejecting Ephesus 2. The whole East accepted Ephesus 2. Okay, all of the East for 2 years. And then Theodosius had an accidental death when he fell off his horse. Marcion became emperor. Everything changed. So this is the trajectory of Christendom and Eastern Christianity. If you step out of, like, I'm Oriental, you're Eastern, if we step out of it and look objectively, this is crazy. Like, it's, what are the odds of this happening? Like, from one emperor falling off his horse, Christian history changes completely. And then we can get into the details of what happened at Chalcedon or happened at Ephesus 2. But I want to propose the question to David now. David, what is your opinion regarding what constitutes an ecumenical council before it is happening? So not a later council approving it, but in the time of the council. And why, so this is really the question, why is Ephesus 2 not an ecumenical council? Not because Chalcedon said it's not, but in its own situation, why is it not an ecumenical council?
Well, to start with that, I want to start from the last. So the problem with that question, the problem with that kind of question is that it kind of avoids what our understanding of receptionism is. So for example, a future council rejecting a council is a form, it's a tool in our reception theory, you can say. So for example, if there's a council and a lot of bishops accept it, 2 years later there's another council and the same bishops reject it, then, you know, we can say that's a method of how that council is rejected. As a matter of fact, this is precisely what happens with Ephesus 2. Honigman, this is in the Acts, Honigman computed that out of the 130 bishops at Ephesus 2, 119 of them were at Chalcedon. And most of them were in session 1, and most of them attacked Dioscorus, claiming that what he did was skullduggery. Now, I want to kind of stop there, so I want to talk about other stuff. So what makes a council ecumenical? Well, first of all, ecumenical council means imperial council, and that's very important because none of the ecumenical councils in Orthodoxy, none of them were like without an imperial approval. As a matter of fact, there's a Lateran Synod in 649. The Lateran Synod was not considered as ecumenical because of this reason, even though the Lateran Synod did propose a Orthodox understanding of the two wills. It was not an ecumenical council, and because it wasn't an imperial council. And there's that, but at the same time, I will say that how does an ecumenical council become an ecumenical council? Well, it depends on, like, what's the question? Is it about, you know, how does a council become dogmatic? Is that the council? Because I will argue that the ecumenical councils aren't the only councils that are dogmatic. I will say actually there are councils that are not ecumenical, you could say, that are also dogmatic. I mean, Constantinople I wasn't considered as an ecumenical council, but it was still a dogmatic council. Its theology was dogmatic, right? You couldn't have been an Apollinarian and validly not be considered as someone that goes against dogma in the 5th century, for example. So there's that, and I talked about that. So with regards to Ephesus 2, I think that's a good starting point. Constantinople 448 is also a good starting point. I will say the objections you raised to Chalcedon could be raised to Ephesus 2 because it was also a response to the Home Synod of 448. And all the Home Synod did is anathematize Eutyches because he spoke of two natures before the union, which Severus himself accepts as heresy in his letters to Sergius the Grammarian. And he says there's two natures before the union, but only one nature. And then when he was pressed on, he rejected the double consubstantiality. So he was excommunicated. He was anathematized because of that. And the same people that anathematized him, by the way, used the from two natures formula. They used Miaphysite expressions, right? And so then comes Ephesus 2. And at Ephesus 2, something very interesting happens. Saint Flavian and Eusebius and Domnus of Antioch, Theodoret, Ibas, all of these people, some of them innocent, some of them not. All of these people were deposed, but they weren't allowed to defend themselves. They couldn't defend themselves. And this point was made in session 1. This point is made by scholarship. And the argument of Chalcedon is really that the depositions at Ephesus 2, they were uncanonical, and we needed a council to reverse those uncanonical depositions. And that's, yeah, you're right. Session 4 says that. Session 4, Diogenes of Cyzicus says, I mean, we're here because of Eutyches, right? Like, what's our other reason? And he's saying that in response to the, how we should have a new definition and all that. But he points out, yeah, this is like the reason why the council happened in the first place. I don't think that's an invalid reason. I think that's a fully valid reason. If there's a skullduggery happening at a previous council, another council correcting that, I think that's a valid reason to have a council. I don't think 2 years is like, for example, you gave the example of the Pope of Rome rejecting Ephesus 2, and you had the case of, I think there's a background noise coming. Is that from you, Craig?
Maybe if you hear baby talking.
Yeah. So where was I? So there's the Tome of Leo. Tome of Leo not being read. So what's also interesting in session 1, Dioscorus at first says, I read the Tome of Leo. I received it and I read it. Then they read the minutes. And then Dioscorus says, oh, they did not allow me to read it. And then the bishops say, no, we didn't do that. That didn't happen. So there's also that going on where even in session 1, Dioscorus is not really fully honest with what's going on. And in regards to Ephesus 2, the grounds of it excommunicating Saint Flavian, the reasoning wasn't really even good. It's really just because he spoke of two natures and he anathematized someone that spoke of one nature. And then turns out the very same people said, oh, wait, the guy we defended was a heretic, which is why in Ephesus 3, which is an encyclical letter accepted by multiple bishops, in Ephesus 3, this encyclical letter, it doesn't condemn Eutyches as a heretic. I will say you do accept him as a heretic, even at that time, but it doesn't name him. Why? Because he was accepted at Ephesus 2, and that kind of like, they didn't want that awkwardness come up. So I will say, if you look at, like, my argument will be, if you looked at what happened in Ephesus 2, and if you looked at in Chalcedon as a response, I will say there's plentiful good reasons to not accept Ephesus 2. I will also raise the other problem with the amount of people excommunicated, because you have Saint Flavian excommunicated. He's replaced by Anatolius, who was handpicked by Dioscorus, but then he turned on Dioscorus at a Chalcedon. I think we both know that. And then Domnus was excommunicated. So two major patriarchs excommunicated. One of them, by the way, another point, Saint Flavian should have been numbered 1, but he wasn't numbered 1. He was numbered 5th. So that's another instance of uncanonical proceedings. But then the tome wasn't read. And then, so Leo doesn't like that. And he removes Dioscorus' name from the diptychs. This is not an excommunication, but he removes his name from the diptychs. So I want to mention that as well. So I'm not accused of dishonesty. But the response of Dioscorus was then, oh, you did that? Okay, I'll go to the next step and I'll excommunicate you too. So what happened after Ephesus 2? Constantinople excommunicated, higher than Alexandria. Antioch excommunicated, and then now Rome. So you have three major patriarchs excommunicated. Why? Because of a Monophysite heretic. That's why. So bearing all of this in mind and seeing Chalcedon happening, I don't think it's really surprising. And again, with how to finalize this with how we understand what is dogmatic and what is not, the three principles as mentioned by St. Augustine and St. Vincent of Lerins, which is also quoted at Chalcedon, which is antiquity, universality, and consensus, right? These three things is how we can determine what's dogma. And there's different methods of how that's understood. And so, for example, Rome not accepting Ephesus 2 already showcases that it wasn't accepted by everyone. So that already puts a step in the way of Ephesus 2 being ecumenical. And then the whole church never, as a whole, accepted Ephesus 2. Therefore, we cannot argue. You can argue, obviously, from your case, and I do accept the argument. For you, it is dogmatic, yes, because at certain point, your whole church accepted it. But for us, between those 2 years, that cannot be said for us, right? So some little communities can accept the council, but if the church entirety doesn't accept it, then the church is not speaking that the council is dogmatic. If that's not the case, then between 449 and 451, we cannot say that Ephesus was a dogmatic council by any means. You could say for yourself, as I said, you can say it's a correct council, it's a dogmatic from your side, but at the time, according to that church, we cannot say it was dogmatic. That's my response. So I think I believe I covered all of this stuff. Yeah, I think I covered all of this stuff.
So I'm going to make some comments, and then I'm going to give it to Subdeacon Daniel to only briefly respond to that so we could move forward in the conversation, and then we'll cover the interlude between the times, because I think David was doing that between Ephesus 2 and Chalcedon, and then we'll get into the meat of Chalcedon. I have a few comments, which I'm just going to pick at both you guys a little bit. I'll start with David. It sounded like David was saying, maybe I'm hearing things wrong, that Constantinople I really wasn't properly an ecumenical council. I think we need to look at this in several ways, which is, one, I think the word ecumenical council is somewhat anachronistic, right? When we say ecumenical council now, what we're always thinking about is when the church all came together and said it spoke something authoritative, it can't be reformed, it's dogmatic, it's almost right up there with the Bible, right? And so Eastern Orthodox affirm there being 7 councils that meet that sort of standard. But the word ecumenical council didn't quite have that inference, implication rather, at the time they're having ecumenical councils. So in the synodical letter of Constantinople I, it calls itself an ecumenical council. Likewise, in the Semi-Arian councils preceding Constantinople I, they also call themselves ecumenical councils. Ephesus II called itself an ecumenical council. And Augustine used a different word in Latin. He'd call them plenary councils, and he didn't believe every plenary council is infallible, because clearly there's tons of heretical ones. So it's important to keep in mind there's ecumenical and ecumenical in these discussions. It gets forgotten a lot by the audience, by people that are not too observant when it comes to history. So David might have not gone into that sort of nuance. I wanted to bring that up. I also just want to say that due to the canons, and I know David's aware of this because he mentions in one of his videos, due to the canons of Constantinople I being accepted by Alexandria, being accepted by Rome in the West, they had all the Latin collections of canon law have the canons of Constantinople I. We see implications in session 1 of Chalcedon and other councils that they accepted these canons. That being the case, it seems to me that the whole church considered Constantinople I authoritative, and in my opinion, it's sort of this debate about Canon 28 that occurred after the fact that then people said, well, maybe it really wasn't, or something like that. Or even Ephesus 2, where there was some disagreement over, what's the creed. And you could definitely see this among the Egyptian bishops, where they seem to only say Nicaea, Ephesus 1, But at that point, there was already problems because of Ephesus too. So I just want to put that out there. Now,
can I add something? Can I add something quick? Sorry, but this is
well,
very short.
No. You could when you get your time, then you can say I'm full of crap.
Okay.
I'm gonna pick at David now. I'm not David. I just did that. Daniel. He talks about an ingredients for ecumenical council. Again, when it comes to an ecumenical council and those ingredients, we have a definition of this in Nicaea 2, which is obviously not affirmed by Subdeacon Daniel. But Eastern Orthodox have a definition. You need consent of all the bishoprics, not only the pentarchy. You need the consent of bishops outside the ecumene. All right, this is what's said in Nicaea 2. So essentially, you need everyone to receive it. So if that's the Eastern Orthodox standard for an ecumenical council, clearly Ephesus 2, which Constantinople didn't accept it, Antioch without changing bishops didn't accept it, Rome didn't accept it. It wouldn't meet that standard. Subdeacon Dan and I spoke on this before, but it's something I want to bring up. Lastly, let's see. There was a comment made that all the East accepted Ephesus 2. Not quite. I'd like when we talk about the interlude, because it clearly wasn't at the council because they'd excommunicate people. So hopefully Subdeacon Daniel could flesh out, well, how so? What happened after that council where he takes that inference from history? Because, I don't think Subdeacon Dan's just making stuff up. But I will make this comment on my very little reading, which I brought up to Subdeacon Dan on Ephesus 2. Ephesus 2's minutes read a lot more similarly to Constantinople 2's than, let's say, Chalcedon's. There does not appear to be, it was either like whoever the people that were doing the minutes were not, being very exact with what people said, or they're heavily edited, if not what's his name, Thucydides, when he gave people speeches, were essentially imaginary speeches, and he called it history. That was more legitimate back then, by the way. I'm not trying to say that in a bad way. But compare that to Chalcedon. Chalcedon clearly was like, they were very exact to make sure they were taking everyone's comments and putting it into the minutes. Why is this important? My personal reading of what I've seen in Ephesus 2 is they do look heavily doctored. And it's not coincidental that a lot of the partisans of Ephesus 2 point to everyone else. They doctored the minutes of this council. They doctored the minutes of that council. And something I've been told, if you have a girlfriend that's always accusing you of cheating, you better watch out because she's cheating on you. It's a sort of basic psychology. So that's my ignorant inferences I draw from Ephesus 2. So I'm going to bring this back to Subdeacon Daniel now that I've made my comments, and we'll keep the ball rolling.
Thanks, guys. So just off the bat, just a quick reply to the point. So you have the same bishops present at 448. They're at 449 now. They changed their minds at 449. The same guys. The scholars asked them, did you sign this? Did you say this? They're like, no, we didn't mean it like that. We were under pressure, whatever. This is what we believe in 449. 2 years later at Chalcedon, again, the same bishops. Did you guys say this? Did you sign this? No, we didn't mean that. So these people changed their minds 3 times, except Dioscoros. So when the Acts of Ephesus are being read, and by the way, the evidence that it was treated as an authoritative council in the East, ecumenical authoritative council by the whole East, is the fact that Eusebius himself, who was deposed at Chalcedon, calls it an ecumenical holy great council, because that's what it was. The emperor treated it that way, the same emperor who was in Cyril's time in 431. It's just an authoritative imperial thing. There is no, it wasn't at the time a matter of opinion, unless you were the Pope of Rome. He thought he had an opinion, but everybody else in the East did not. They treated it like it was valid. Now, when I say, you mentioned the bishops at Constantinople and Antioch. Constantinople and Antioch, if we're going by that logic, that not all the patriarchs accepted it, and because you're not counting that they were deposed, even though Dominus was a straight-up heretic, like there's no question about it. Flavian, we can argue all day. Dominus was for sure an historian. So, but if we're going by the logic that that all the patriarchs have to accept, like you said, at 787, if they're even outside of the empire, then we can't say Chalcedon is ecumenical, because Alexandria didn't, and Ethiopia didn't, and Eritrea didn't, and Armenia didn't, so, and Persia didn't. So we can't say that. I don't know if that is true objectively. Now, so, and back to what I'm trying to say about these bishops who are changing their minds in 3 different councils. You have Dioscoros, who is the only one who's being honest the whole time, and even when the minutes are being read, those bishops who are changing their minds are the ones who are saying that's not real. Who cares what they say? They keep changing their minds. Juvenal was the one, and notice Dioscoros didn't preside alone. He presided with Juvenal and Thessalius, right? So the 3 of them were presiding under the rule of the emperor. The emperor called for this council intentionally to exonerate Eutyches. That was the point of it, because that's what the emperor wanted. He purposely called for it for that reason, Theodosius. Okay, so then when these 3 presidents are presiding, it wasn't, if you read the minutes, it wasn't Dioscoros who didn't allow the tome to be read. He was actually asking. He asked 3 times. Juvenal did not allow it to be read. And even when Flavian's statement of faith was read at Chalcedon, Dioscoros said, keep going, when everyone's like, oh, this is Orthodox. Dioscoros said, keep going. Let's see what he says. Let's finish the whole Acts of 448, and let's see what he says, Flavio. And Juvenal, right before he switched sides, he says, yeah, it sounds Orthodox up to this point. Let's keep going. He said that, he stood up, and he switched sides. So Juvenal himself, he's the one who didn't allow the tome to be read. He's the one who actually still has suspicions. And the fact that it wasn't accepted in the East, Chalcedon, and Ephesus was accepted in the East, even after the fact, is that by imperial force were the Chalcedonians in the East in power until very shortly after. Jerusalem becomes non-Chalcedonian for 20 years, from 459 to 479. Antioch from 468 to 488. Alexandria is always, Constantinople's back and forth. The Henoticon had to happen in order to keep the peace, in order to preserve somewhat of a Chalcedonian vestige. It was the non-Chalcedonians who had the strength during that time. So it was actually in the interest of the minority Chalcedonians for the Henoticon to be in place, which is now anathematized by both sides, but especially by the Chalcedonians. And that is where Eutyches is officially mentioned as anathema. So yes, Eutyches, he's a heretic, but he did give an Orthodox statement of faith. Whether he was a heretic or not, he gave an Orthodox statement of faith in 449. In 448, pardon my language, he was just stupid. He's like, I don't know what consubstantial means. How do you not know what consubstantial means? It's very simple. It's a very simple idea. He's consubstantial with the Father and with us. It's very easy. But he was saying, I don't know what that means. So then at 449, he says, he gives the Cyrillian statement of faith. And I actually want to talk about what Craig mentioned about Constantinople 381. And actually, it's also addressed to David because he says Flavian was listed as 5th. So Constantinople 381 was not recognized as imperially authoritative. It may be ecumenical, but not imperially authoritative. And the evidence is 431. 431 makes no mention of it. So the rankings in Rome's view and in Alexandria's view is that Alexandria ranks higher than Constantinople. Again, how do we know? 403, Theophilus deposes John Chrysostom. 431, Cyril deposes Nestorius. 449, Dioscoros deposes Flavian. Right? And in the Acts, and look, this proves the Acts of Ephesus were not tampered with, is that In the Acts of Ephesus 2, according to Chalcedon, Flavian is said, they're asking Flavian to defend himself. Flavian says, "You're not letting me talk. I want to talk to defend myself, but you're not letting me." If the Acts are tampered with, they wouldn't have written that. They would just make, it's a blank check they have. They have a blank check to make up the story however they want. But they don't do that. And Juvenal, notice, the people who are not saying the Acts are tampered with were Juvenal and Thessalius. They don't say that. Even though they switch sides, they're not saying the Acts are tampered with at all. So it's I don't think we are being honest if we're saying that there are small communities in the East. It was imperially authoritative until even at Chalcedon, they're referring to Ephesus 2 as a holy and great council until the synod decides. But before it decides, just like they're saying, our holy devout bishop Diostoros until he's deposed, right? And they're also saying about Ephesus 2 that it's an imperially authoritative council, holy council. He calls it holy, Eusebius, and it deposed him.
All right, is it my turn? Oh, yeah. So, actually, before I start, where did Eusebius say that Ephesus 2 was a holy dogmatic council? Where does he say that?
I'll give you the quote. You can go ahead until I find it.
Okay. So, so in the case of Theodosius, there seems to be a dependence on Emperor Theodosius here in this argumentation. I will also like to remind that the Emperor Theodosius favored the Nestorian Council in 431 for quite some time, actually, and Saint Cyril was in arrest. And so I think like even if you're going to be talking about, oh, you shouldn't trust these people because they made dodgy decisions, Emperor Theodosius did the same. And as a matter of fact, Farjan Makikin mentions this in his Cyril of Alexandria Christological Controversy, that Theodosius, like the emperor initially was favoring the Nestorian Council. That was in response to Ephesus 1. So that should also be mentioned. I will say that I don't think the uncanonical charges were responded to, and I will also answer if Dominus is a heretic. I mean, I don't know if I read on him, but Dominus is a heretic. Let's assume that. Then why were none of them allowed to defend themselves? I mean, a lot of them were condemned. Theodort and Ibas were condemned in absentia. Now, if they were brought there, surely it should have been very easy to condemn them and get rid of them. But no, they had to be condemned in absentia. And I also want to note about Ephesus 2 is that it introduced something new. It introduced a monk, Barsomas, as a full member of the council. And monks, until that time, and I don't know if there were cases where monks became full members after that, or if they didn't in our case or in your case, but monks until that time were never full members in any council. That's an innovation. That's what Father Price says. And there's that. So about the ordering of the seats, actually, there is a council in Constantinople presided by Saint Nectarius. I would say, oh, presided by him, right? But there is a council in 394 presided by Saint Nectarius, where Theophilus of Alexandria was there, and guess who was first? Saint Nectarius was first in that council. So actually, after 381, there is a case where Constantinople is recognized as the first, and Alexandria accepted it. Theophilus did not have a problem with it. In the case of St. John Chrysostom and Nestorius, both of them are defendants in the council. If they're defendant, they're not really considered as a full member in the council if they're defendants. So I will also respond to that with that. That's also why, again, Father McCucken talks about this in his book, where Nestorius didn't want to come to the council as a defendant. He wanted the council to be in his own home turf, to have that presiding advantage. Whereas the things that happen around, due to the empresses, the daughters of the emperor basically working for Saint Cyril. Why? Because Nestorius was not a nice person and he constantly stepped on the royalty's toes. So he got kind of screwed over there. And the council was in Ephesus. But Nestorius was actively trying to make sure that didn't happen. So both of them were defendants, so they weren't like full members in the same sense as a normal bishop that wasn't a defendant was. So that will explain why they weren't considered as first. Whereas in the case of Saint Flavian, He was fifth. He went there already as if he was accused. That's what session 1 says about Chalcedon. So there's cases of things going down in the council that is being uncanonical. I will also raise the question, let's say, about the confession of Saint Flavian. You mentioned the confession of Saint Flavian. People were saying it was orthodox. Then Dioscorus said keep on reading. Can you enlighten me what was problematic about the confession of the faith? Because you didn't really finish that. I mean, what's the problem with the confession of faith of Saint Flavian? Is it bad? Is it good? What's the issue with it? I'd like that being answered. I will also say that Theodoret of Cyrus in 448, in a very polemical epistle, this is Chalcedon in context. It's in the book Chalcedon in context. He actually points out, Craig, this was for you. Dioscorus, he says, rejects Constantinople I as being ecumenical, and that he says that he rejected it wholesale. And his argument was because he rejected Canon 2. What is Canon 2? Well, Canon 2 is about bishops basically doing things in their own jurisdiction. And Theodorus says this is why he didn't want it, because he wanted to basically go out and do his own thing as the Alexandrian primate. And now Theodoret, you might say, oh, he's an historian heretic. Who cares what he says? Well, his argument seems to be supported by the fact that Dioscorus uses the title ecumenical patriarch for himself for the first time in Alexandria. It seems like Theodoret is hitting a point here, and I would like to mention that. So, again, let's say the East accepted it and Rome didn't accept it. I don't really see what's the problem here. I mean, Rome being right on an issue doesn't imply papal supremacy. And if Rome accepted it, but another patriarchate didn't accept the council, I will say the same things. There we have Constantinople not accepting it. So, I mean, you had Roman popes that were semi-Arians that accepted semi-Arian creeds. I think Pope Liberius, Saint Liberius, I believe, who accepted semi-Arian. So that's not a case of like, oh, Rome being first, that's why everything Rome says. No, that's not. I don't think that follows. I think what follows is that it wasn't basically accepted by the church wholesale. Now you say the same thing can be said about Chalcedon. Actually, I agree. I say the same thing. I say that the council, in my view, I think the Council of Chalcedon became ecumenical really when the anti-Chalcedonian schism became full-fledged, and when the Orthodox Church became really the Chalcedonian Church for the Chalcedonians, because the anti-Chalcedonians left the church, and then Constantinople II was accepted, and then Constantinople II accepted Chalcedon, and now they were both simultaneously accepted by that. I think that's my logic, that's my argument, and I think that being the case is actually very strong for the council. I will make this argument later on, but I think this makes the case that when Chalcedon was accepted as an ecumenical council, the only interpretation that was accepted was the Cyrillic Chalcedonian interpretation. So the Nestorian and Origenist interpretations that existed during that period were both anathematized. And when those interpretations existed, I will say Chalcedon wasn't it was always a true council, is what I will say. But when we're talking about epistemology, questions concerning epistemology, I will not say that it was epistemologically certain for someone in the church to say Chalcedon is a dogmatic council. If there wasn't an epistemological certainty in the church until that time. So I will actually agree with that argument. But I think, again, I'm actually making the case for Ephesus 2 from your point of view. I'm just saying between those 2 years, I don't think you can make the argument that it was a dogmatic council. Or is like in your view, you can say it was always a dogmatic council, and I will accept that this is your view. But I will say in the church at that time, was it epistemically certain for all Christians that Ephesus 2 was an ecumenical dogmatic council? It wasn't. That's basically my point here.
All right, now I'm going to make my points. We're going to then go back to Deacon Dan, and hopefully we'll be firmly into Chalcedon at that point. Deacon Dan made the point that Eritrea, Ethiopia, etc., didn't receive Chalcedon. This is not true. There's a great map in the Rise of the Monophysite Movement, or whatever the name of the book is, from Friend. And it actually shows cities in the southern part of Egypt and Ethiopia and when they turned Oriental Orthodox. They're Chalcedonian into the late 6th century, early 7th century, one of them to the 8th century. So how were they Chalcedonian if Egypt itself was not Chalcedonian? We know for a fact that Egypt went in and out of being Chalcedonian. We know for a fact that bishops left Chalcedon and then appointed a new bishop in Alexandria, and he was Chalcedonian. And so I'm sure Subdeacon Daniel has a response to that, because Dioscorus did not yet die, but he was deposed. A new bishop was accepted. It was received, and we have evidence over centuries that there was Chalcedonians in Egypt for a long time. So that's why I would actually disagree with both David and Subdeacon Daniel. I think the Nicaea definition is fulfilled. I would also want to add, because on that note, it has to do with the Nestorians. Well, they didn't receive Chalcedon. Then they already go into schism about 15 years beforehand. So if they already left the church unilaterally, then they're no longer part of the church in order to receive it. It's just like if the Orthodox Church, or for that matter, Oriental Orthodox Church, has a council now, you don't have to wait for the Pope of Rome to receive it, because he's outside the church. His reception is now immaterial. I just want to make a quick comment on the deposition of Chrysostom. The deposition would have been legitimate, but he still had right of appeal to the Pope of Rome, because, again, it was an ecumenical council that had all members involved. So I don't think citing that example is all that great. While with Nestorius in Ephesus 1, Alexandria deposed him, Rome deposed him, but he still had recourse to the council, and then he was deposed by the council. So he had no more recourse after that. So there we see the Nicaea II definition working. We see the deposition being affirmed by all, including Alexandria. And so it seems to me sort of this loose approach to canon law that now all of a sudden Dioscorus' deposition is not affirmed, when it was an ecumenical council. It was the highest court of appeals, and he didn't come to the third summons. So I don't accept that argument. I'd have to, now David might be right on this, but I'm just going to quibble, because I'm trying to be an equal opportunity hater, with the monks not being full members of councils. Father Price talks about this in his introduction to Chalcedon, but I have to admit, it's probably been a year and a half since I've read this. But that being said, he speaks about the earliest ecumenical councils even had some degree of lay participation. And we see this in Acts chapter 15. So there would have been lay people, there would have been magistrates, there would have been monks. And really, it's only until like Constantinople II where it became more of a function where even like the emperor really wasn't there. He didn't preside over. I think in Nicaea II, the emperor wasn't there at all. Compare that to Nicaea I, where I think in one of the sessions, Constantine himself presided over it. So what we see is this original model, which is more, at least on the surface, looks a lot more like Acts 15. It's everyone in together. And it became much more ecclesiastical, even though, let's be honest, there was political strings being pulled. But it's so a monk being a member, I'm not sure that's a big deal. Like, you know, and he could sign on saying, I accept it, but really only the acceptance of bishops is relevant. Just like, you know, acceptance of emperor is really immaterial, though that can make it Roman law, obviously. Liberius is not a saint. He's the first Pope of Rome that was not a saint. He broke a streak. I think the first 31 out of 32 bishops of Rome were martyrs. So if you look at, why was Rome such a big deal? I mean, just look at that streak of saints. No other, I think, bishopric could say, we had this many saints in Rome, and 31 of them were martyrs. So it's, but I think Liberius broke that streak. I just wanted to correct something from David. And I'm going to now bring it to Subdeacon Dan.
All right. So a few things real quick, Craig. The Church of the East was actually still in the church. They did not break away in 431. Contrary to popular opinion, they had accepted 431. They broke away in 484. So in 484, this was the Henoticon era. Peter the Fuller was Patriarch of Antioch during the time. And the last Orthodox Catholicos, or Patriarch of the Church of the East, was Baba Wai. He was in communion with Peter the Fuller. Now, in 484, Barsoma of Nisibis, a different Barsoma than the one we're talking about, and he had the Persian king kill Saint Baba Wai and replace him with the Nestorian, his name is Acacius of Seleucia Ctesiphon. So this is the first time now that the Church of the East becomes full-fledged Nestorian. And this is where, after this and ongoing, they replace, for example, St. Ephraim's textbooks with Theodore of Mopsuestia's, and then it just goes on from there. That's when the excommunication happens. But up until 484, they are in the church. So that's real quick. They were still, their opinion still mattered. And the Eusebius quote, David, that you asked for from the Council of Chalcedon. He says, this is 187 in price. You know, how it says the sections, like 186, 187, whatever. I think it's from session 1. He says, during the reading, Eusebius, the most devout bishop of Dorylaeum, said, when Eutyches, whom I had accused, presented his plaint to the Holy Council, and then Price has a footnote saying, look how he's still calling Ephesus 2 a Holy Council. He mentioned that I was his accuser. And then you can read the whole context there. But it's evidence that Eusebius is still saying that it's a Holy Council, even at Chalcedon, even at deposed.
Which part was it again?
I can send you. I have the. I'm gonna just message it to you so you can control F. I put it in the private chat. So, so in this quote, we have to keep in mind two things. Not only that he was deposed, that's one, but even after his deposition at Ephesus 2, he appealed to Rome and escaped there. Rome had a synod reversing everything Ephesus 2 did in 449, and Eusebius is still recognizing Ephesus as the authoritative ecumenical council, not the Roman synod that exonerated him and reversed everything Ephesus 2 did, because the Roman would never call the Roman Church would never call Ephesus 2 that, but Eusebius did because he was an Eastern bishop. Now, also you mentioned the 3 patriarchs being excommunicated at Ephesus 2. Rome was not excommunicated at Ephesus 2. Rome excommunicated Ephesus 2. And the other 2 patriarchs, how else do you depose a patriarch? Obviously, whichever patriarch gets deposed is not going to accept the council that deposes him. Only Eusebius accepts councils that depose him. So, regarding Ephesus 431 and the emperor accepting the Nestorian Ephesus, not the Orthodox Ephesus, Theodosius actually accepted both of them and enforced both of them. And the reason why he did that is because he wanted them to reach an agreement. So Cyril, under pressure from Theodosius and the Pope of Rome, accepted the reunion of 433. Now, in that statement regarding what Craig said about Constantinople being deposed in 431 because of the council, not really, Craig. It depends on which history you view. If you are siding with 2 patriarchs here or 2 patriarchs there, who decides which one is the right one? So if we're saying on one synod you have Constantinople and Antioch deposing Alexandria, and on the other synod you have Rome and Alexandria deposing the other 2. So you have 2 versus 2. 2 patriarchs here, 2 patriarchs there. Emperor recognizes both synods in 431. So we, you, me, David, we recognize 431 because that's our side of it. But that doesn't mean it's an objective view, right? Maybe at the end of the day it's objective, but right now it's Daniel's opinion, David's opinion, and Craig's opinion. And then Jerusalem, I want to mention about Jerusalem switching sides regarding the Ethiopian point you brought up. Yes, there is evidence of a minority presence in Ethiopian history of a Chalcedonian here or there. The vast majority view of the kingdom is a non-Chalcedonian one of the empire, right? But just like how Jerusalem was a fortress and a bastion of non-Chalcedonianism until the 6th century, and now who can speak of a non-Chalcedonian? After that, once you get to the 6th century, it's as if it was never non-Chalcedonian. It's as if it was always Chalcedonian. But we know that's not how it was. It was actually the opposite. In the same way, you can say, sure, there was a Chalcedonian here or there in Ethiopia, but it doesn't mean the Ethiopian church accepted Chalcedon. We can't say that. The same we can't say the Armenian church or even the Georgian church, which is now Eastern Orthodox, initially was not. So I think that David has a point in the idea of everybody accepting. I don't think that that's true in church history, and it shouldn't be something we measure truth by. Sometimes truth is in the minority. I think that I'm pretty sure I'm missing some things that David brought up, some questions that he asked me, and I have the notes here, but I'm not seeing. David, is there anything else you asked me that I'm forgetting to answer?
The seating order is one of those I asked.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
394.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, the seating order. And then actually, I wanted to talk about this and the Saint Barsoma of Samosata.
Yes.
So the monk being there, I actually, although Craig's point helps us, I actually agree with David on that, because it is weird. Like and it doesn't, like Craig said, it's not a big deal. Nothing changes, but because of the sensitivity of canon law and like the little intricacies of this really strict conservativeness coming down through these councils, it was such a big deal for them. It's not a big deal in the big picture of things, but it's a big deal in that it's a difference in practice now. There's something new that's been introduced in the discipline. But in the same way, this pentarchy idea is also a new one. It's not an original one. So for Constantinople, the Synod of 381 to have been imperially authoritative, even if, and then we know from Ephesus 3:475, and Peter the Fuller as actually the first patriarch of any church in Christendom to introduce that creed into the liturgy. So even though the Chalcedonians accepted 381 officially before the non-Chalcedonians did, it was the non-Chalcedonians that included that creed in their liturgy before the Chalcedonians did. So regarding the theology there's no issue with between any of us, and being ecumenical liturgically for all the Oriental Orthodox, every Sunday we say that it's an ecumenical council, 381. But regarding up until the point of, it was not viewed in the same way, and this is very clear. It's not viewed in the same way as Nicaea and as 431. It's not even close, by no side, up until this point. Chalcedon makes it equal. Before that, it was a holy council. There are saints there, Saint Meletius, etc. But it was not on that same tier. So for Constantinople to be 1 or 2 or 3, it wasn't thought of. At Chalcedon, they say about Ephesus, look how they said Flavian is 5. Like they disrespected Flavian by saying he's number 5. And then the Romans, in like a smart reply, they say, see how we have him number 1. But really, they have him number 1. So they're actually number 1. The Romans replied, we have him number 1. So they're actually the 1A. And then after that is 1. And then if you read Chadwick and Palmer, both of them, they talk about, and Friend too, they talk about the relations between Anatolius and the deal he had with Leo leading up to Chalcedon. After 449, until Chalcedon, you see why Constantinople is now an absolute, this is higher than Alexandria, because of that 2-year-long working on agreement between the new patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope of Rome. Leo agrees to it. He agrees to Canon 3 of Constantinople 381, and then he switches as soon as he gets what he wants. Sorry, like I know I'm not trying to diss the saint for you guys. It's not my intention. I'm just speaking like from history. Leo changes his mind about the agreement that he agreed, and that's why he rejects Canon 28 later. So Rome has been flip-floppy with this anyways, you know?
Yeah, we're at 11 minutes, so we'll give it to David.
Yeah, and I will say, yeah, Rome flip-flopped at the time, yeah, and I think it was a question that many bishops asked: why is Rome accepting Chalcedon and not accepting one of the canons? That doesn't make any sense. I will agree with you there. I don't think I don't think it attacks your point. I would also like to correct, not correct, but I will also like to say, I said full member, so there was lay participation. I admit that there was lay participation. There were monks. The same monks came to Chalcedon in order to, give testimony. But I'm saying full participation. Barsumas was a full participant, as if he was a bishop when he wasn't. So that's like my point. And I will also like to add, in terms of the deals that Anatolius had with Saint Leo, the same can be said for Dioscorus and Eutyches. I forgot to mention this. I want to mention it now. Dioscorus actually accepted Eutyches back into communion before Ephesus 2. And so you can say, yes, Eutyches said good things at Ephesus 2. But that didn't happen when Dioscorus got him back into communion. And what the Eutyches say, there was 2 natures before the union, now there's 1. 2 natures before the union, Severus of Antioch anathematizes it. So Dioscorus accepted that, even though he said something that his own church rejected. About the point about Constantinople 1, yes, I do understand that you accept it as ecumenical, but the fact that you accept it as ecumenical is actually proving that you're admitting that you were wrong, because you wouldn't say that Constantinople 1 became true and its canons became true when we accepted it. You will say it became true after the council was declared, right? But the question, so it was like that in actuality. But epistemically speaking, you could say you weren't certain, but you're still nevertheless admitting that you were actually in the wrong in not adhering to the seating orders by saying that Constantinople 1 is accepted. And I will still nevertheless press on the point. I mean, there's a Synod 394 with St. Nectarius. I don't think that was really responded to. I want to keep this short so we can talk about Chalcedon itself. That's what the stream is about, since I mentioned that. About pentarchy, I don't think I make any point about pentarchy. I don't believe in a pentarchy in an epistemic way. In when we talk about accepting what church is right, what church is wrong. I will also mention that. Would you agree with me, Subdeacon Daniel, that we were part of the same church? We just didn't accept what council was the ecumenical one until the Jacobite schism. Will you say that we were part of the same church? Would you agree with that? And so, there was I'm making this point not to make an objection, just to inform the viewers. The schism happened over time. So many people think that, Chalcedon happened, instant schism. Well, actually, no. It happened a century later. So there were Nestorianizers in the church. There were people that rejected Chalcedon in the church. There were Origenists in the church. So there were different groups that were in the church at the time. That's why I'm saying it's difficult for me to argue that Chalcedon was epistemically speaking, that it was a council that we can say is 100% dogmatic. And about the Pope and the East, Pope versus East, that's kind of I think this is kind of something, because in the previous discussions he makes the same point. So I want to say that Patriarch Akakius, Dioscorus, Constantinople II opposed the Pope. They excommunicated the Pope, or they excommunicated the Pope. Constantinople II basically said, this Pope is not even a real Pope. It's basically saying that we're in communion with Rome, but this guy's not the Pope, kind of this kind of an idea in Constantinople. So I wouldn't say that the Pope was always Chalcedonian and the East was anti-Chalcedonian. No, I think there were instances where there was tension from both sides, where Rome attacked and then the East attacked. And again, I want to keep this short. I think I talked about all of my notes here. I want to get to Chalcedon now, in my honest opinion, because I think that's what we are here for. We talked about this for an hour already.
Yeah, we got another 7 minutes, so get into it.
Get into Chalcedon? Or
Chalcedon.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I wanna talk about, well, I already in my debate review mentioned multiple different points about the Chalcedonic Council. The context is obviously important as well, the intention of the council. And what I want to talk about is that on surface level, many of the anti-Chalcedonian objections against Chalcedon were very strong. On surface, it seemed very strong. One of the arguments was that miaphysis was a patristic statement, patristic formula, whereas diaphysis, that's not patristic. You don't see this in the fathers explicitly. This was one of the arguments at the time. We don't hear this argument anymore, and I'm going to explain why we don't hear this anymore. Another argument is that it accepted the companions, you could say, the supporters of Nestorius, Ibas, and Theodoret, right? This is one of the anathemas of Dioscorus in the 6 anathemas against Chalcedon. It talks of the Tome of Leo, right? Very obvious one. Tome of Leo seems to be speaking of 2 subjects. And Severus's point as well, some people make this argument that Dioscorus said, I don't say in 2 natures, I say from 2 natures. And they say, well, that's a Cyrillian statement. Kirill said this all the time. And what does Chalcedon do? Oh, they say in 2 natures. And in the first draft, Chalcedon had from 2 natures. And in the second draft, they changed that to in 2 natures. So you see all of these arguments collected together. And it seems like there's a very strong case that Chalcedon was an Nestorian council. I want to briefly give an overview of my responses to those arguments, because when we look into the argumentation, when we look into the arguments themselves and what actually happened, I don't think it's strong. So number one, this is an overview. If you want to get into the detail of the Tome of Leo, I'm ready to. But with the Tome of Leo, there's 2 things that refute that the Tome of Leo, speaking of double subject. Number one is that the statements he makes is supported by the Church Fathers. Number 2, the council itself says that we interpret the Tome of Leo by the eyes of Cyrillian theology. How do we see this? There was a 5-day commission at Chalcedon that cross-checked the tome, because the Illyrian and the Palestinian bishops, I believe, opposed the tome. And then you had a 5-day commission. They looked at Kirill's writings and they compared it to the Tome of Leo. And the people that objected to the tome, they later on said, oh, we looked into it, we researched it, and we saw that it was right. Number 2, why Peter spoke through Leo. That's a popular phrase. Roman Catholics say that a lot, but they forget to mention that Peter spoke through Leo, because the same bishops say Leo and Kirill said the same thing. So the standard of orthodoxy from this is evidently Saint Kirill of Alexandria. When it comes to the definition of the faith, I will say that the definition of faith includes many Cyrillian statements. Even the in 2 natures formula is from Saint Kirill himself. And all I need to point out is Glaphyra. He explicitly says in Glaphyra, I believe this is the part in Leviticus, I've mentioned this in the debate, he says that Christ is in 2 natures very, very explicitly. And so there is actually support from St. Kirill himself and also many other fathers, not only St. Kirill, but at the same time, it is qualified in the way St. Kirill qualifies it, right? So distinction in contemplation, the natures are distinguished in contemplation. That's a Cyrillian argument. Nestorians will say that it's a concrete distinction. If there's a concrete distinction, then, if there's a distinction in the first place, then there must be a plurality. If it's a concrete distinction, there is a concrete distinction between the natures. That means there are 2 natures with their hypostasis. That's the Nestorian argument. So one of the arguments is that Chalcedon does not preclude prosopic union understanding. I think actually their definition completely does. Absolutely it does. You can't have a Nestorian Christology if you distinguish the natures in contemplation like St. Kirill does, and like many of the Cappadocian fathers does. David Bradshaw has a great article on this and a great video on this, on distinction kat epinoia. You can find it on YouTube. It's a great article that explains how the distinction works. In regards to Theodoret and Ibas, I will say that, first of all, in the case of Theodoret, it's not as simple as it looks. If you read Eranistus, Theodoret himself uses Cyrillian argumentation. Now, does that clear him of all suspicion? I think he has many defects in his Christology, but those defects do not relate to actually to two-person Christology. The defect I'm talking to is that he rejects theopaschism because in Antiochian terminology, God equals divine nature. To say God suffered means divine nature suffered. So that's a defect. I think that's a theological defect as well, but it doesn't relate to the controversy it has. So it isn't as simple as that with the case of Theodoret. I'm not going to die on the hill, but it's not as simple as it looks like. In the case of Ibas, you have the letter to Mari, that's something that I bet we will debate. But I'll take the worst case scenario for this overview. With the letter to Mari, we have only 2 people saying that the letter was Orthodox out of a sea of people, and just because a council has some people saying, "Oh, this is Orthodox," I'm taking the absolute worst case scenario for our side. Doesn't mean there's a dogmatic letter. I don't think anyone even made that argument. I don't think anyone made. I'm willing to be corrected on this, but I don't think anyone made the argument that, oh, this letter is a dogmatic level on the same level as like Saint Leo's citations for his tome, for example, or any of this. No, I don't think that's actually dogmatic on that level. It's just a letter that was read at council. If that's dogmatic, then Photius and Eustathius' letter that was read in support is also dogmatic. So yeah, those are my responses. But I'm very willing to have a good conversation on this because I love the council, the discussions.
I'm going to just make a few points. I'll try to be even quicker, but I'm going to warn, if this really gets into the EBUS territory, I've done a bunch of stuff on that. It's tied into things that I'm writing back and forth with Father Kimmel, so that could blow up. But I'm going to try to stay away from that. There's a few comments about the Nestorians only going schism 484. I thought part of the problem was, again, according to the Oriental Orthodox view of history, is that Ebus is a Nestorian. Theodoret's a Nestorian. They accepted Chalcedon. They're restored by Chalcedon. So what's the problem here? The extreme Nestorians are the ones that went to schism or did not accept, or were not even part of the issue of Chalcedon, because Nestorianism was in the Persian Empire. So delayed reception, then all of them not accepting, but the ones that were able to go to council did accept it. In fact, Nestorius himself sought it as validation of his views. And we know that from, I can't pronounce the name of that book.
Bazaar of Heraclides. Yeah.
Sounds legit. There was an issue about Eusebius calling Ephesus too holy. Now, I just want some people know, like, when you read Chalcedon, like, they're even calling, like, Dioscorus, the most holy bishop of Alexandria, when he's, like, in trial. And even when they're deposing him, they're calling him that. And so, like, you go, well, you know, how should we take this? I don't agree with everything Father Price says, but if you read the footnote to where it says what is happening when he calls Ephesus to a holy synod, it says that that Rusticus expresses surprise at Eusebius calling Ephesus too holy, but the honorific is automatic, and Chalcedon had not yet declared proceedings of the council null and void. So that'd be true of like how everyone's treated in the council, just like they're calling Theodosius II blessed. And it makes it confusing because they're also calling Kirill blessed, and there's no doubt they considered him a saint and they were venerating him at that point. It's just that the language wasn't different yet. So it's just, we have to, just like the word ecumenical, there's ecumenical councils and there's ecumenical council. So we have to understand the emphasis, and just the word sometimes doesn't convey it. What level were the letters of, let's say, Ebus, Theodoret? This is a concept that's tough because everyone argues. I think we're almost arguing all like Protestants and Roman Catholics, so we're not seeing these things as they saw them. I'm just going to cite Father Price. He calls this conciliar fundamentalism. And the view came into being, he argues. I think Athanasius had it because he talks about that. He talks about this in his letter De Senatus. But the view was that everything uttered in ecumenical council was infallible. And so, for example, in the Bible itself, we have things that are, you know, like the king of Assyria saying terrible things that God won't save you. So we don't think that's infallible. We think that God inherently had that verbiage and allowed that guy to say that, and the overall message is inerrant. You know, not that we agree with the Assyrian guy says this and it's heretical, and we agree with the next guy says and it says that and it's in contradiction. We need to look at this how we look at the scriptures. So the point is, with those letters, the question whether they affirmed or not was important. That's why the Fifth Council took it so serious. That's why in the Sixth Council, they took serious that the term one energy was in Vigilius's letter and his acceptance of Constantinople II. And there was a big debate whether it was even originally there or it was a later corruption of the manuscript record. Why go into that if it's just not everything Vigilius wrote about is infallible? So it is on the table. It is important. In the minutes of Constantinople II, they allowed for the fact that one or two bishops could have been wrong. It's also worth saying that most of the bishops that accepted it did not cite any letter whatsoever. They cited that he condemned the stories from Eutychius. But also, and we could get into this, but this may be better for another episode, there's valid grounds for saying that the letter at issue was the letter of the bishops of Edessa, the priest of Edessa, rather, in support of Ebus, because they're not stupid. They weren't going to say, Ebus's letter was Orthodox when it was used against him. I mean, like, that was the whole point. So it's like it presupposes they were just stupid or falling asleep in the wheel. And maybe Maximus of Antioch, but it's to presume like that Pasacius was, Pascasinus was, and whatnot. I think it's a bridge too far. So anyway, I'm going to give this a little extra time to good old Subdeacon Daniel. Let's get into Chalcedon.
All right. So I want to start off by saying the tome, I understand it was double-checked by the Illyrian and Palestinian bishops. I agree. It's a matter of fact. It's not an opinion. At the same time, that's irrelevant to Rome. So Rome did not care that they were going to check or not check. For Rome, it was non-negotiable. There was no option. They came into the synod different than Ephesus 2. They're still mad because of that. So they're coming in this one. This is the tome. Accept it or we're leaving. There's no option for them. So it's really interesting to see how Rome views itself. Like, I understand, none of us here are Roman Catholic. We don't care. But the way Rome thought about itself in the Chalcedonian context is key to understanding Chalcedon. Dioscoros was going to be deposed at Chalcedon, period. There is nothing that could have changed that. Price, I agree with Craig, Price is not infallible, but in a footnote that he said, I respect his opinion because he's a scholar, I'm not. So in a footnote that he says, even though it is speculative, he says, Dioscoros damned himself when he said, I accept from two natures. Because that, like David said, would have been the definition. But because he said it, therefore it's not going to be. Now it's going to be in two natures because they don't want him to accept it, because they want him to be deposed. In the same way, Eutyches had to be exonerated at Ephesus 2 because the emperor wanted it to be so, period. So in any case, so then Eutyches is presenting a statement of orthodoxy at that synod. And the rule, the canon law, is anyone who deposes an Orthodox person is now has to be deposed. So even if Flavian was Orthodox and Eusebius was Orthodox, even if, not saying they were, I don't know, but even if, then, but because they deposed an quote-unquote Orthodox person, now they have to be deposed. So that's really the reason of their deposition. And this is because the emperor had predetermined this was going to happen. So Dioscoros is executing this on behalf of the emperor. In the same way, Marcion and Leo decided Dioscoros was going to be deposed. This sounds ugly, like from a historical perspective, from an objective perspective, but sadly, councils function this way a lot of the time. Now, let's see. Okay, Antiochian Christology, you said you're not going to die on that hill, so I'm not going to be too long about it. I just want to be clear real quick. The schooling names, I strongly disagree with. When people say Alexandrian school, Antiochian school, it's not true. It's an oversimplification. There's a lot of evidence before Diodor's school, Antiochian Christology was very single subject and Theopaschae. And I've actually gotten into debates with Assyrian Church of the East people and proved this to them beyond a doubt. Now, just like a quick kind of point, the Creed of Antioch, before the Nicene Creed before everyone had to conform to it, the Creed of Antioch used to say, and actually in the Syriac Church it still does, it used to say Mother of God in the creed itself. In Antioch, 100 years before Ephesus. So in 325 in Antioch, they were saying Mother of God already. So you would think that's crazy since they were the ones fighting it. But that's because Theodore and his school reversed everything when they came around. So I would not make the argument that Ibas's letter was dogmatic. I agree, it was not. I do believe that the council thought it was orthodox and not problematic. But I believe the whole council of Chalcedon thought it was a non-problematic and normal orthodox statement, but not a dogmatic one. And Craig's point about Maximus, Maximus is not really the deciding factor in this case. So Dominus had already approved of the letter. Edessa was under Dominus at the time when you were mentioning, and so was Beirut. So the patriarch himself, and even Ibas at Chalcedon, he says, if I anathematize or whatever, it's because of my patriarch, like John, and then Dominus. So Dominus was an historian. So then we can't really measure by the patriarch. Maximus, when he's there, he's one of the guys, just like Anatolius is. They were both Alexandrians, both put in there by Dioscoros's influence, switch sides, Maximus and Anatolius. So Maximus then, he's not in a position to say anything at this time. Like, this is all kind of a big, let's figure this out. We gotta keep our C's, right? Because he was a part of this whole mess too. So whatever happens, happens. Ibas was restored by Leo before this. Leo, the Roman Synod, had refuted Ephesus II before Chalcedon. Like, Leo would have. I agree with Craig's point about the way Eusebius referred to Ephesus II as holy, the same way they were referring to Dioscoros as holy before these things were deposed and refuted. But for Leo and Rome, that was already not the case. They did not need Chalcedon for them to do that. In their mind, in the Roman mind, the See of Rome, Chalcedon was not the ones that made the decision. For them, the Pope was. It's hard to get away from that. Like, who cares for us? But I'm telling you, this is how Rome thought. Now, okay, Craig mentioned Nestorians. How are they? They accepted Chalcedon, therefore they weren't Nestorians. So the word Nestorian, it's probably wrong because the Christology existed before him, you know. So I like to say dio-hypostatics, but you can't really think that they had an alternative. Any dio-hypostatic person on the Roman side of the border would have accepted Chalcedon, because that's their choice to get back in, right? Nestorius himself accepted it. I'm not saying the council is Nestorian or not. That's not the argument I'm making right now. I'm just trying to tell you there isn't an Assyrian Church of the East at this time. It doesn't exist in a schismatic sense. It doesn't exist. The Persian Church was still in communion. So the dio-hypostatics would accept Chalcedon, because that's like the closest thing that they have. And the evidence of that is there are Nestorians, like David mentioned earlier, that were still in communion with the church until 553 on the Roman side of the border. And then I take notes as best as I can. I'm probably missing something, but yeah, I'm done.
Okay, I want to ask something. Let's do a bit more like active discussion, because I think that will help us.
I wanted to ask David, sorry. And again, I did not really participate in the Christological debate that happened last time, but I do have a Christological point, and I'm sure you can explain this. But in the Tome of Leo, he says, I'm going to read the quote. I know you're familiar with it. He says, "For each of the forms affects in partnership with the other that which belongs to itself. The Word doing that which belongs to the Word, and the body performing the things which belong to the body." So here, I don't know, and again, you can explain this, but the Word for any Easterner at least, and even us in English, off the bat, the Word is a hypostasis. The Word is not a nature. That's the second person of the Trinity. So when he's saying the Word doing, sorry, the Word.
What pertains to the Word?
The Word and the body performing the things which belong to the body.
Yeah.
That sounds to any Easterner, even if it's not what it means, it sounds to the Easterner like two hypostases here. So you can imagine then, if you're a Christian living in Jerusalem and Juvenal tells you before he goes, saying, if I go to Chalcedon and accept it, don't let me back in. He tells you that, and then he goes to Chalcedon and he accepts it, and then he comes back. So he gets deposed right away. For 2 years, the army brings him back, and then in 459, you have a non-Chalcedonian patriarch for the next 20 years. So do you, as an Eastern Christian, then, do you kind of blame the East for being so kind of traumatized? I don't know what the word is, but like allergic to this.
This turned into from a Christological question to a historical one.
Well,
I'm not knocking you, but
that's how I think. Sorry.
Okay, so in the sense of Christological, actually there are fathers that refer to Word of God as the divine nature in a linguistic fashion. Saint John of Damascus does this with his dialogue with the Saracens. He explicitly says in his dialogue that the Word of God, when I say the Word of God, I'm referring to the divine essence. I'm not referring to the hypostasis, Jesus Christ. So that does happen, and I think now I made this point in my video about Nestorius. He does like give certain titles and names for natures. Now, obviously, that explains the viewpoint that Nestorius has, but I will say that probably comes from history. He didn't come up with it himself. Obviously, the application he uses with the titles is obviously wrong. In the video, I already make a case against Nestorius why exactly he's wrong. It's not just the basic. It's the video Nestorianism and the Council of Chalcedon. It's like the part 5 of my History of Christian Theology series. I make these points. So I'm not going to repeat them here. In regards to accepting the tome of Leo. So basically, what I'm saying is that when Leo says the Word of God, he's talking about divine form. So he's talking about the divine essence, not the hypostasis. In terms of how people can understand it, well, I will say people that don't have full information about the council could accept that in that sense. But two things here. Number one, the acts were out in very honest fashion. That was fully out, including its mistakes. So with proper investigation of the council, you can probably find out. And this is the second point. With proper investigation, you can find out that the tome was interpreted in a Cyrillian fashion. That's why the whole thing that I just talked about happened in the first place. So in regards to the tome of Leo, that's basically my explanation. As I mentioned in the debate, there's a sea of patristic quotations that say what Saint Leo is saying, including Saint Cyril of Alexandria. And I want to ask, I want this to kind of be more like instantaneous now, because we have like turns where we talked. I want to ask you something. Do you have any problems with the definition of the faith in Chalcedon? Oh, about from to natures. I want to mention that too. So from to natures wasn't rejected because of Dioscorus. I will say that it was rejected. The idea of Chalcedon was that they noticed that there was a heresy going on, Eutychianism, and even before Eutychianism, this was something that happened. And I will say this was influenced by the Apollinarian forgeries attributed to the certain fathers. And Leitzman, in his book on Apollinaris, makes the case, a very strong scholarly case, that all of the statements, the Miaphysite statements from the fathers, prior to Saint Cyril using it for his own theology, and that only happened after 433, were all Apollinarian forgeries. And people were heavily influenced by those forgeries. And so some parties looked at those and they say, okay, there's one nature. That means that's one substance, right? That's not like one component or one reality. People interpret it as substance. And then you had Synusias, and Saint Cyril himself said, no, you're doing this completely wrong. And even those who were partisans of the Miaphysite formula I believe I mentioned this in the debate. This was in the letter with Akakius, I believe. I don't forget. I forgot exactly, but I quoted during the debate about how he says, "Well, yes, one nature, but by the way, can we speak of like human nature and divine nature after the union?" And St. Cyril says, "Yes, I mean you're doing this correctly." So I will say that attribute to the confusion in regards to from two natures. So what Chalcedon wants to do is basically prevent any sort of understanding of Eutychianism. Now, the common argument initially was that Chalcedon was an historian. Now the common argument is kind of like it doesn't preclude Nestorianism. I want to say that that can be turned on its head. Alternatively, I think if you look at the history of the Oriental churches, of the anti-Chalcedonian position, if you want to say that we had traces of Nestorianism, likewise, the other side had traces of Eutychianism. And I think Julian of Halicarnassus is an excellent example of this because he is a textbook Eutychian. He believes the properties of Christ, human and divine properties, were not actually distinct. He will say that they were distinct, but they're not actually distinct. So this Thomistic word salad nonsense that he basically employed. And that's textbook Eutychianism because he's rejecting that Christ had human properties, that there was any distinction in the first place. And so if there's only one property, can we really say that Christ was human in the first place? Well, it seems to be that we cannot speak of him as a human. So that's how it reduced itself to Eutychianism. And the anti-Chalcedonian side will agree with me on this. So if we had Nestorianizers, the other side also had Eutychianizers. And my point really is just saying that I don't think that I know you're not making that argument. You said yourself you're not making that argument, but I'm saying this for the people that would make that argument because I have seen people making this argument ad nauseum, and it's kind of like getting to me. So I want to ask: do you have any problems with the definition of the faith in Chalcedon? Do you think that it has any issues? Do you think it's acceptable the way it's formulated? Would you have Paul made the response during the debate? He said "glorizumenon," right, does not mean in contemplation, whereas I showed Patrick Gray. I read his book and I read critical sections of this book multiple times. He makes this case pretty much both at Chalcedon and after Chalcedon. That's how Chalcedon is understood, the way the natures are distinguished. So bearing that in mind, will you say that the definition has any issues, any dogmatic issues? Do you think it pronounces something heretical, or is there a legitimate way that you can look at it from here? Like, I guess what I'm asking is, can you really construct a Nestorian argument from the definition of the faith at Chalcedon? Is that even possible? Do you think it's even possible? Because I don't think it's possible.
Okay, so I think that I'm not versed enough on the definition of faith exactly regarding Christology. However, I don't. Do you believe that just like a quick question, so I can get to mine? Do you believe that the filioque can be understood in an Orthodox way?
I think, yeah, but if you're talking about energetic procession, yeah. If you're talking about hypostatic procession, it's definitely heretical. But I will say, in any of the Church Father statement, that hypostatic procession definition, if you look at it, if you look at its theology in full, I don't think you can make that interpretation even possible. I don't think it's even possible.
Okay, but just in the word itself, it can be understood in an Orthodox way. Just the and the sign.
If you're talking about energetic procession, yes. If you're talking about hypostatic procession, no.
Okay. Now, I think in the same way how it's possible that it could be understood in an Orthodox way, yet it should not be added to the creed. In the same way, perhaps the Chalcedonian definition could be, but not as a definition of faith, but as something that is tolerable. So, and the reason why I say that is because I, as an individual layperson, a subdeacon, nobody, how can I say that our synods are saying that we've had the same Christology the whole time? I know it's vague. I'm not a fan of the agreements, like you're not a fan of the agreements, but that is what they're saying, and we're not Protestant, so we have to be obedient to that. You know, the churches in Constantinople and Antioch and Greece and Alexandria. They wrote this, and they wrote that, and in Rome. They said we not only are they said that, they said we've actually had the same Christology the whole time. So if that's what they're saying, I can't say that they're wrong. I can only speak for myself. That's one thing. There's another point you made about Julian. So yes, Julian, as we know, he's anathema for Oriental Orthodox too. And I wouldn't say, I think as much, okay, so John of Antioch, Theodoret, and these people, before we're talking, because John of Antioch's still on. So they signed off on Nestorius being anathema, and they signed off on Theotokos. At the same time, they did not, when I think it was, forgot who the name of the bishop of Constantinople was after Nestorius, Proclus, something like that.
Saint Proclus.
Yeah, he in his letters with Cyril and Father John Baer, he wrote a book. It's called Against Theodore and Theodore. It's really good. In their back and forth, and the Bishop of Melitene, and I think even Eustathius of Beirut, in the back and forth, they're telling Cyril, anathematize Theodore of Mopsuestia. And Cyril replies, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, essentially saying, I know he was a heretic, but, because Cyril himself wrote against him, but if we anathematize him, these guys will schism again. Because they said, the Antiochian party said, if he gets anathematized, we would rather burn in hell than anathematize Theodore. So the same people who had already accepted Ephesus 431 and the formula of reunion, anathematizing Nestorius, accepting Theotokos, are still really heretics. So they still believe in Theodore, that Theodore is not only is he a saint, but they call him the exegete. Like he is number one to them. So in the same way, and there's historical evidence of this, this is not an opinion, there were people who believed in that Christology, even when they anathematized people like Nestorius, even when they accept the phrase Theotokos, they can still accept Chalcedon in a heretical way. So whereas David and Craig, let's say, accept Chalcedon in an orthodox way, they can accept Chalcedon in a heretical way, in the same way someone like Eutyches or Julian, maybe, yeah, even Julian, can accept Ephesus 431 in a heretical way, right? So the council leaves room. So today, if we're talking, like which history won out? I'm not talking about imperially, obviously you guys, but I'm talking about Christologically, which Christology won out. And I would say the Christology that won out is the one that the agreements today have been signed on, which is something that we would both say is our Christology won out. But the Christology that didn't win out is the one that the double subject. And we don't see it in Oriental Orthodoxy. We don't even see monophysitism in Oriental Orthodoxy. We don't see anybody in Oriental Orthodoxy, any bishop or anybody saying something like Jesus wasn't fully human or not consubstantial with us or anything like Eutyches was saying. But we do see some minority of Eastern Orthodox who do say things like there are two hypostases in Christ, or like they divide him. Like I actually want to. I haven't really had the opportunity to have like a real civil, cordial conversation like this with one of those Eastern Orthodox, but I would want to ask them, then why don't you just become Assyrian Church of the East? I don't understand. What's the difference between you and them? But the point is, as a Chalcedonian Eastern Orthodox person, you can be in communion with such a person. It's a possibility. Whereas in Oriental Orthodoxy, we can't. Not only can we not be in communion with someone like that, but even as a Monophysite, we can't be in communion with them. So to me, this is the safest Christology.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask a quick question. Do you think you can be in communion with someone who believes grace is created?
No.
Metropolitan Bishop Damiettos, though, has a document where he argues that grace is created, and he argues. I've heard some responses. Paul himself responded to me in DMs, and he said, "Oh, his argument is faulty because of that," and I'm ready to accept that. But Metropolitan Bishop does seem to make that argument. So, won't you say that he's wrong in saying grace is created?
And I would say that the reason why this is an issue in Oriental Orthodoxy is because in 2020 it's an issue, is because now the world is smaller. We know about what the Greeks have said, and we know about what the Latins have said, and the Orientals have never dealt with it on an official level, in a council or anything like that. We didn't have like the councils you had. So now we're dealing with it for the first time. We don't have an official thing. Theology, there is one.
Well, okay, but doesn't that also mean that if you're talking about the safest, most closest to accuracy Christology, won't that also be like relevant in this discussion as well? Like, just other things as well, because I mean, we have dealt a lot about these issues regarding essence aegis distinction, right? And I will say you yourself believe in the distinction. My question will be in what way? Like, is it because we have it dogmatically defined due to the Palamite synods, as some people might say, that happened in the 14th century? It's been cleared out, and you had Synod of Blackernay that clears out energetic procession in response to filioque and all of these things. But if you're going to talk about the theological, historical based theological purity, then wouldn't it be the case that we're kind of way better at that because we had to deal with these issues, whereas from your side you didn't really have to? I mean, forgive me, I might not be understanding the argument too much, but in regards to that, I think that's kind of like what you're saying to me. It feels like, we dealt with the issue of theopaschism. In us, you cannot be anti-theopascite. You cannot be a dual subject Christology. Whereas with Chalcedon, you can maybe. But I think if you extend that to wholesale other things, then the ball is on your court, and it's not a ball. It's a potato that's going to explode in your hand, basically. I think there's a really good argument that you can make from Chalcedon itself that yes, there were, historically speaking, you're 100% right when you're saying historically speaking, there were Nestorianizers in the church. As a matter of fact, this book makes the point itself. He's talking about Patrick Gray is talking about Nestorianizers in the church and how they interpret Chalcedon. I don't deny that. What I'm arguing is this. I think their arguments are just inconsistent. I don't think you can make a consistent case looking at only Chalcedon, just only Chalcedon. I don't think anyone can make a consistent Nestorian Christology from Chalcedon consistently. I don't think that's even possible. And the basis of my argument is the fact that the natures are distinguished in thought, not in concrete. I think that's a very strong point. And I don't think you can have a dual subject Christology if the distinction is not concrete. If the distinction is not concrete, then you can't even have subjects in the first place. It's actually impossible. So I guess that's what I will say.
Okay. There was a point you were saying regarding in the first part of your answer about I forgot now. What was the first thing you were asking me in the beginning?
About the definition of the faith?
No, in this reply right
now. It's about thank you for reminding me. I also forgot to respond. So it was about whether you can which Christology or theology was the purest one. It's basically that, because we can go to the history and I can find statements from Damian of Alexandria saying that God is just an abstract concept that the persons participate in. That's very heretical, and I think you can have that position because a saint had that position in the past. But I also wanted to add, I say I wanted to add, but I forgot what I wanted to add. So you can answer that question while I try to remember that. But basically, which question? Oh, sorry. My brain is frantic today. It's about 1990 agreements. I want to have a go at that. First of all, not all churches in the Orthodox Church accepted those agreements. Mount Athos straight up didn't accept it. They refused even a dialogue. Russia wanted further questioning because they make the point I make in saying, well, we see these statements, but we're not really certain what these statements mean for both sides. And that's what the question is. And I think you can be in the Orthodox Church and depend on how Moscow responded, how other patriarchs responded, and say, I don't really buy this document. I don't think it's like this. I don't think agreement is dogmatic. I think I can reject it and say, this might have certain truths, but wholesale, it's not really anything substantive. And my argument is basically, it's just that it's what the document says is already what we both said for millennium, but it doesn't handle the issues it doesn't handle the critical issues where we diverge in regards to how do we understand the hypostatic union. That's not mentioned, right? Is there union of two hypostases, or is there union of two substances, right? I mean, that hasn't been fleshed out, and I think if that's not fleshed out, I can't really agree with this document full sail. I don't think it really does anything.
I think that Craig doesn't have to agree because he's Bulgarian Orthodox, but I think that synods, if you are under a synod as an adult individual, you are choosing to be under a synod. So then that synod makes those decisions for us. I'm one of them. There's the Ethiopian and Eritreans. They haven't agreed to anything. So I can also say the same thing. I actually respect them. They're amazing. They're like the least modernist out of everybody. They're awesome. But at the same time, I don't know how, like, for example, let's say you, I think you're under Constantinople. So you can, if you're having lunch with His Holiness Bartholomew, right? And you tell him that, and he tells you, well, I agree. So then that's it, right? Like, he's the patriarch. That's it. Now about Nestorianizers, I think that your point about it's impossible for someone to interpret Chalcedon isolated that way. I think that's the point.
In a consistent manner is my argument. Yeah.
I think that I respect that opinion. If I was Eastern Orthodox, I would also hold it. But at the end of the day, I think it's an opinion. If we're isolating it. If we're not isolating it, no, because Constantinople 553, clearly there's no room anymore. But if we're isolating it, it's an opinion. It's a respectable opinion. I think that the failure to anathematize the letter of Ibas is a problem, and the Chalcedonians even admitted this. So it's like they admitted it after the fact, and that's why 553 does anathematize it, right? Despite Rome, 553 anathematizes. Rome is forced to sign, causes schism in the West. You know the history there. So, in the Oriental side, yes, there are undefined things like ADS or whatever, where you will find it, and there are bishops with different opinions and whatever, because it's not defined. But if we're talking about Christology, you can have, like, I remember I was at I think it was Ukrainian Orthodox, Moscow Patriarchate, Ukrainian Orthodox. I don't remember, actually, I don't remember. I'm pretty sure it was Moscow Patriarchate in Pennsylvania, in like a rural area. I was at their Vespers and visiting. I heard it was going with a friend. So the priest, I guess, knew I was Oriental Orthodox. So he says in the homily or whatever, he says, we all need to believe that Jesus Christ was a human person. Okay? I know it's heretical, even for you, even for me. But he can, like, somehow.
It's not heretical. It's just question mark. It's just question mark. I mean, you can say that if you predicate humanity to his nature, you can say human person if you're predicating that humanness to the nature, not to person in and of itself. It's like saying Christ is a created person. Well, Actually, yeah, but if you're talking about his personhood, the formal hypostasis, basically, then that is heretical. But that's open to interpretation because we have fathers that speak of the divine human person. Well, that's attributing, is predicating that to the natures. Yeah.
I think what we agree on is that the subject of the incarnation was the divine word only, right? So in that sense, he's a divine person only. So for this priest to say Jesus is a human person because an Oriental Orthodox individual is there, like what are the odds? It's the only time I go, and that's when he said it, right? So it seems like he can say it because of Chalcedon. Whether it's heretical or not, Chalcedon leaves room for him and others who we've talked about it, me and you, off the air, to say things like that. So this is not about David being heretical or even Chalcedon being heretical, but this is about heresy being allowed. So you brought up Damien of Alexandria. Damien of Alexandria with Peter of Antioch, it's a big like confused era. Both of these patriarchs excommunicated each other, both misunderstood each other, and then as soon as there were new patriarchs, that was over. It's not like a key thing.
But Paul in the debate made Damien's arguments against me. He said properties are the hypostasis. I mean, that's Damien's argument against Peter, is that the hypostatic properties are the hypostasis themselves. That's a key argument Damien makes. So it does affect his Christology.
So I think what Paul meant, and again, I don't know much about this, but I think what Paul meant was the particular reality, I think it's called, right? Particular reality with the properties, that's what a hypostasis means. Like hypostasis is defined by a particular substance with properties. Good?
Can you repeat that again? My brain just went to it.
Sure. Actually, I have a quote. Okay, let me give it to you from Paul.
Was it the one you sent? Oh, from Paul. Okay.
So what is particular? As soon as
just so you guys know, this will be the last question, and then we'll do audience questions.
All right. So as soon as if there's a particular essence or a particular substance, particularized substance, that is a hypostasis. You're on mute, David. You're on mute. You're still on mute.
Am I unmuted now? Yeah, I am. Okay. I pressed it twice and it didn't unmute me. Doesn't that mean that hypostasis is the essence? It's just a different mode that essence exists in. I think that's
particularized essence, and the property.
Yeah, but if it's just reduced to that, then I don't see any difference from Damien's argumentation. I think it's the same argumentation he makes.
I'm telling you that I think, and Daniel doesn't know this, but I think that there are Oriental Orthodox who know more than me who can defend Damien's belief. I think that there's a way to defend it.
And this is a bit of off topic, but I don't like another problem with Damien's triadology is that it kind of destroys the monarchy of the Father because it places such an emphasis on God just being this abstract unity that all the persons participate in. This is literally what he says. And my point is about this theology. I'll cut this short because I think we're going to go to question and answers. But all of this, if you have different Christological presuppositions in your Christology, in your theology, it can lead to problems even in the Trinity. So, for example, if you believe that Christ cannot have two natures, whatever you think nature means, because multiplicity implies separation, for example, then that's going to apply to the Trinity. Then you're going to say, well, the persons are three persons. There's a real distinction.
that means the persons are really separate. And then Severus of Antioch, what does he say? Letter 19, letter 22, letter 33, he says, yes, they are separate. And it doesn't qualify it like St. Basil does. So that kind of like raises questions. So I guess my point is basically that like all of this, if you want to talk about the historicity and like how certain unspecific statements can lead to heresies, that goes both ways. And I think it can even go worse for the other side because it seems like that from conversations that I had with some people.
You brought up Theopascatism earlier and how Eastern Orthodox have to accept it, but that wasn't always the case. Rome was rejecting Theopascatism up until 553. It was kind of forced on them. So even when the emperors would go to Rome to ask them to accept Theopascatism, Rome was saying no.
But can I add something it's very important, because why they rejected this is because the Theopascat formula was inserted in the Trisagion hymn. That's the problem, because the Trisagion hymn, my problem with the Theopascat formula in that hymn itself is that the Trisagion hymn was a Trinitarian hymn. After Peter changed it, it only became a Christological hymn. So it reduced the meaning of the Trisagion hymn. And that's actually one of the issues that people that rejected that had. And they see it as a Trinitarian hymn. And it also applies to the person of Christ. It applies to all persons, the hymn, but not only apply to Christ. And I'm pointing out why they rejected that. The reason why they rejected that in the first place is because they looked at the Trisagion hymn. They saw this refers to the Trinity, and then said, well, that means the God you're talking about is, you're talking about a divine nature. You're not talking about Christ as a person when you say God. You're talking about the divine nature, and that means the divine nature suffered. We can't accept that. That's the mindset that they had. So it wasn't just like that because they were Nestorians and they rejected Saint Cyril. No, it's because of that's basically the reason that they had.
Yeah, but Antioch had always thought before Peter before the issue there, before that, the idea of saying Holy God, Holy Almighty, Holy Immortal was always to the Son. Was always to the person of the Son. And the evidence is this, besides history, just the theology of it. Why is there any Christological debate or discussion regarding the immortality of the Holy Spirit? The divinity of the Holy Spirit, yes. Almighty of the Holy Spirit, but why is there any question if he's immortal? It would only make sense regarding God the Word. So in Antioch, I'm not speaking for Constantinople, but in Antioch, that's how the people thought anyway. So Peter, that's why it was such a big problem to reverse what Peter did. The problem wasn't Peter adding it. Peter adding it was accepted and happily, even by Chalcedonians, such as someone who is canonized in your church, Flavian of Antioch II, before Severus. He even had it. He had left it in. And all the Chalcedonian patriarchs of the Henoticon era had left it in. So for the Antioch Christians, the problem became when to remove the clause and not the adding in of it, because for the Antiochians, that's how they thought about it anyway.
Okay, I can bite that, but I still think that thought is reductionist in how they view the hymn. I think if you look at the Trisagion hymn, and I mean it should already give a hint that it's referring to the Trinity, not just one person. And
well, in Revelation they say it to the Lamb.
Yeah, but okay. But I agree there. I myself said you can apply the hymn to any person of the Trinity as well. It's both Trinitarian, also Christological, also pneumatological. It's also regarding the person of the Father. I'm not denying that. If it's Trinitarian, then it has to deal with the person specifically as well. So it applies to all of the persons. I think we can go to the question and answers if we don't have anything more to add.
Let's do it. I got church tomorrow. A lot of driving.
Yeah.
Anyway. Okay, Daniel and David comment on the Chalcedonian persecution of the Oriental Orthodox. I'm going to let Subdeacon Daniel go first, and then I'll give David a response. Try to take a minute.
Sure. So we know in right after Chalcedon, there was a persecution period up until the Henoticon. really kind of before the Henoticon, the persecution stopped, like the late 450s. The persecution stopped until, and people like to say there was a Chalcedonian persecution by the Oriental Orthodox. I haven't seen any substantial evidence of that. There are cases where, like, there's like ecclesiastical nepotism or things like that, but there wasn't like actual killing people or chasing them underground. That was only one side. The Chalcedonians were doing it to the non-Chalcedonians, especially after 418, and then, which was when the Libellus happened, and then again in 536 after the Synod of Constantinople that Pope Agapetus presided over. That used to be thought of as an ecumenical council. So it was these two instances that were the hardest times after 451 happened, where there's stories like, for example, they tried to force a non-Chalcedonian monk to receive the Eucharist, and he spit the Eucharist out, so he was burned for doing that. The reason why they were trying to forcefully commune the non-Chalcedonians is because this is how you enter the church. So by like a visible sign of unity, right? So by not receiving communion from Chalcedonian ministers, the non-Chalcedonians are then, they have another church. There's another church, not the imperial one. So by doing that now, there's not only one church anymore. So this was illegal. There could only be one church, and that would be the imperial church.
Great, David?
Yeah, the first thought, I never really hit the persecution angle. It doesn't really particularly bother me, and this might be not. This might make people not like me, make them think I'm a psychopath or something. But it never bothers me. Like this, even if it happens to me, I never, for example, like when I argue with Muslims, I never say you persecuted me. I don't really even bring it up. I don't really, because it doesn't really. I don't really care. I think. This is a different topic, but I think when I see Saint Justinian have Codex Justinian, right, and penalize certain groups of people, I'm not going to say who because I don't want Craig to be demonetized, but when I see that, I'm like, and I'm not talking about anti-Chalcedonians, but I'm talking about other groups. When I see that, I'm like, great. So I say, great. I mean, I'm in full support of that. I don't have any problem with that. So I'm not going to pretend as if like I have a dog in this fight. Now, I will say, Chalcedon persecution of the O, yeah, this happened. I think this happened in imperial level. Definitely, yeah. On the other side, there were, I think, Saint Proterius was assassinated. There were some others from the other side too. But was there like this institutionalized oppression from the Orientals towards the Eastern Orthodox? For that to happen, the Orientals will have to have an institution. And I don't think they were head of the imperial institution. The only time they had a strong hand, was when the emperor was Anastasius. And so you can look in during that time. I don't really,
maybe Zeno too. Maybe.
Yeah. So I didn't research those things because it doesn't interest me. But maybe you can research that and see instances like that. Ultimately, to me, it doesn't really concern me. I don't think like. You can have if one side persecute the other side like very hard, that doesn't mean that the side that persecuted is wrong on theology. I mean, you can say the same thing for, there are probably numerous different heretical groups that were persecuted, and we will both agree that they were heretics and wrong, right? Not many groups come to my mind right now, but Donatists will be one, pagans will be other, right? I personally, when I see persecution of pagans, I'm like, great. I don't have any problems with that, morally speaking.
Yeah.
This might surprise some people, but it doesn't really morally affect me. So if it happened to us, I will say I understand why. Like this happens.
I'm against persecutions, and this channel we're against persecutions. But I will say this because it tied to the next question: was there an Oriental Orthodox versus Chalcedonians? Most definitely, I'm going to answer that question. 30% of Ptolemaic Egypt was Greek. Where did all the Greek speakers go? They just disappeared magically? Come on. We're persecuted by the cops. Scholars like Friends speak about how this really was, he denies it in the first 100 pages of his book that it was, really wasn't political. And then the rest of the book, it's pretty much, yes, it was political. the Patriarch of Alexandria was almost like the viceroy of Egypt. For whatever reason, after the age of Constantine, it was a very political position. There was not only a lot of money, there was military power. And there was definitely killings, like, Chalcedonian bishops that were killed, lynchings, persecutions. These Greeks didn't just appear. How in the 6th century was it like, all right, 95% Copt and 5% Greek? Where did all the Greeks go? We know where the Jews went, for example. They were persecuted outside of Alexandria. They were kicked out. Jews at some point were about 10% during the Ptolemaic area of Alexandria, and that persisted into the Roman times. So, yeah, we could actually point to certain policies and actors which led to the persecution of Jews in Alexandria. Where did all the Greek speakers go? I mean, there's Greeks now in the Eastern Orthodox Patriarchate of Egypt. A lot of them are like immigrants since like after World War II. So they're Greeks, but from Greece. They're not like native Greeks from Egypt. They were genocided away or forced out. And people like talking about this because they're not like historically this oppressed group. But I think when we, no offense to David, we talk more about the persecution of Pontic Greeks, when that becomes more of a sexier topic in scholarship, they will look more seriously at what happened to all the Greeks in Egypt. There was definitely persecution. You can't get that change in demographics without that. So that's my comment from the Eastern Orthodox side. Let me give that to now Subdeacon Daniel to give a response.
I don't think we can assume that they were genocided or forced out just because they're not there anymore. It could also be they converted. Just like how there are no Greeks in Syria. And Syria used to be Greek, especially Western Syria was all Greek. And Palestine was all Greek. So these areas were Greek, and they're not Greek now. We don't know, unless we study the subject and we see what the scholars say, we cannot say that they were genocided or forced out. We can say they converted, they culturally converted, they Copticized, Arabized, whatever. But it doesn't, like, there are probably a bunch of Middle Eastern people that have Greek blood, right? And there are and let's think about it like this too, because we're speaking very anachronistically, all three of us, regarding this subject. It wasn't Copts are Oriental, Syriacs are Oriental, Greeks are Chalcedonian. That's not how it used to be. It used to be very mixed. So, for example, the patriarchs on the non-Chalcedonian side in Antioch were ethnically Greek, and the patriarchs on the Chalcedonian side of Antioch were ethnically Syriac. So now it's not, because the populations that had accepted a view or the other eventually became the majority. But originally, like, you have Ephraim of Amid and Abraham and some other bishops of the Chalcedonian side, they were Syriac. And you have Peter the Fuller and Severus, they were Greek. In Egypt was the same. There wasn't really a distinction between ethnically Copt and ethnically Greek at that time yet. That didn't yet exist. So for them, there was no view that way. So to talk about a Coptic genocide of Greeks, that is an anachronistic way to think. And the same in Syria. There was no Syriac persecution of Greeks there. And if there was, it would be Syriac Chalcedonians persecuting Greek non-Chalcedonians.
David, do you want to make a quick comment, or we want to move to the next question?
Yeah, I want to say that is possible, but it's, as I said, it's possible. I think both. Here's what I think about the concept of persecution. I want to say I'm a Pontic Greek myself, ethnically speaking. So obviously I'm aware of the genocides, and I live in Turkey, and this topic haunted me for years. So I have experience in this, like, kind of like being that group. I just want to say that I think what a persecution indicates is that I'm not saying it's a morally good thing, by the way, in all cases, but what it indicates is that the people are taking it seriously, what they believe in seriously. I don't like it when I see that people aren't taking their faith seriously. So I guess that kind of explains why I'm like kind of like getting this counter reaction. But I will say that a lot of Copts took their faith seriously, and some of the people took it in a bad. I think there is a possibility for that. And I will also like to say again, if they did it, I don't think they're like inherently evil people for doing that. I think people have that mindset, but I think it's understandable how that happens, because you kind of have to have the mindset of living in that civilization to really understand it. The civilization we live in is kind of like this like apathetic civilization where we don't care about anyone. It's kind of like, yeah. So you have to understand that mindset. And I don't think it's like an evil mindset. It happened in the Bible. Both Christians and people fighting against Christians did it.
Now, I'm going to keep the question up only temporarily because it covers David's face. Question for Daniel. You said Chalcedon allowed for some to hold Nestorian views. How is that different than Arianism at Constantinople decades after Nicaea condemned the Arian heresy?
It's not different. That's why Constantinople 381 happened. That's why Constantinople 553 happened.
David?
Thank you, because a lot of Coptic apologists miss this, and yeah, I agree. That's basically why I make these points about you had Eutychianism too. Is because it isn't because I'm arguing against their position. Oh, you're wrong because this position was allowed. My argument, I understand that. I will also agree that in their position, it's inconsistent to have Julianist views if they accept the dogmatic statements. I'm just saying my point is basically counter to the popular Oriental point that some people are. So thank you, Subdeacon Daniel Kakish, for being honest. I mean, that's why I'm chatting with you.
Now we got Elijah Yassi. Question for Subdeacon Daniel. Did the Oscars try to get the tome read during Ephesus 2? Did he prevent that so that supposedly Rome doesn't get excommunicated for heresy? Seems to be speaking out both sides of your mouth. Response?
I've tried. I've actually practiced in the mirror, tried to speak out of both sides.
Doing it right now.
So, I didn't say Dioscoros tried to prevent the tome from being read so that Rome doesn't get excommunicated. I said the synod did. And I actually, if we're talking about specific individuals, I would say Juvenal specifically. Because Dioscoros did ask for it to be read 3 times. Now, it's in the Acts of Ephesus. For us to say that's not true is speculative. All we have to work with is the Acts of Ephesus. And if we want to, and then after that, we can depend on commentary of people who were there. If we want to talk about the bishops who denied this, I don't think they're reliable since they change their minds all the time. Whoever's in power, they're good with them. So, really, we kind of have to take his word for it because Juvenal himself doesn't say that that's not true. When Dioscoros says, I asked for it to be read 3 times, Juvenal doesn't say, no, you didn't.
All right.
Yeah. Can I respond just short note? I want to add that I think there's a good possibility that that question might be a rhetorical question or basically a question to the air. It's kind of like if you have a very strict person and you're asking people, do you have any questions, when you don't want any questions. If the people feel that air in that room, they're like, I'm not going to ask questions because this person is going to screw me up, then you're not going to have any questions. So it can be rhetorical, and I think there's good evidence considering there has been like heavy suppression in the council as well. Papal legates talk about this. It's not just bishops that are like flip-flop all the time. And one can ask, why are the bishops flip-flopping? Are they flip-flopping because they don't have faith in their beliefs, or are they flip-flopping because they simply were, suppressed, or because they were influenced by a charismatic figure that told them what to do, right? Again, multiple interpretations. I think that I just want to talk about the possibility of that.
I want to say this historically, which is in session 1 at Chalcedon. They all say, we didn't really sign on to that. They forced us, and we put our signatures, and they added a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
No, and I know Subdeacon Dan is laughing about it, but you read the minutes of Chalcedon, and you could tell they have a fair amount of integrity. There's a lot of debate. There's embarrassing details. You read the minutes of Ephesus 2, like I said, it seems like the same person wrote every person's signature, because the way they talk is totally different from how they talk in the next council. The way they talk sounds like the same guy is talking. And so there seems to be something to what they're saying in Chalcedon 1, where maybe they didn't have Theodosius II, you know, having a spear at their throats. They felt a little more free to talk differently than however Ephesus 2 went down, and maybe they really write their signatures. I mean, it's again, that's just
a spear on their throat.
All right. So anyway, why did Nestorianism survive after Ephesus? I'll give this to David first, then Sadiq and Daniel.
So why did Nestorianism survive after Ephesus? It's basically a heretical group trying to exist within the structure. This has happened with Arians, with Eunomians, with Apollinarians. This has happened throughout history. So I think both me and Sadiq and Daniel Kakish will agree that that councils can condemn views, but the same views that get condemned can still exist within that structure. But again, I will argue that even if that is the case and that happens for both sides, this is a point that benefits us both, is that they cannot be consistent when they do it. So with Severin Zealot's debate with the fake Orthodox duo, true Orthodox duo, the true Orthodox duo point out that Nestorians, they accepted the Chalcedon word, but they modified some of the texts to make it more favorable to their position. They pointed that out. So again, this kind of stuff has happened. So that's my explanation.
Something in that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that these people are very, very smart. And we have to be honest, and it implicates both of our sides. There have been a lot of times where bishops have compromised things in order to keep their see or keep their power, or whatever it is. In a lot of cases in church history, it's happened. So, and this is one of the times is that they find ways, they find loopholes. So like these, where in a council that explicitly anathematizes Nestorius, like Chalcedon and the Tome, people who believe in that Christology, not in Nestorius himself, but in that Christology, can find a way to make it fit here. So, and this, if you read, I forgot the name of the book, but it's a history on the Assyrian Church of the East and how long they were in communion with the Chalcedonians. So, essentially, the Assyrian Church of the East can accept, it could fit for them to accept Chalcedon as a Christological definition, besides the canonization and stuff that are anathema of Nestorius. But once Constantinople 553 happens, it's no longer possible. The Assyrian Church of the East can't. It doesn't fit with them anymore. So, these people can find ways, like Ibasa, Theodoret, and Dominus. They can find ways to make it fit, just like John of Antioch can find a way to accept 433 and 431, yet still canonize Theodore of Mopsuestia. It can happen.
All right. So if saying two Chiani in Syriac is linguistically unacceptable, then one physis be linguistically unacceptable in Greek without diaphysit and two physis qualifications.
I don't know the Greek enough, but I can tell you the Syriac. Tu Chiane is unacceptable because a Chiana means being. It means being not just in Syriac, it means being in Arabic too. So like if we say, we can't say the Trinity is three Chiane, because then we would be saying the Trinity, God is three beings. He's not. So, but the Greek, what was the Greek part of the question? Can you put that up again? Then wouldn't one physis be linguistically unacceptable in Greek without diaphysite in two physis qualifications? Not really, because mia is a composite, just like how David preferred on the debate last time. He don't want it to be called diaphysitism versus miaphysitism, because David says both are acceptable. But the problem with, in his opinion, from the miaphysite view, is that the intolerance of Oriental Orthodoxy of diaphysite, whereas in Chalcedonian Christology, both are okay. Mia is a composite; it's not mono. So he is a composite 1 out of 2 in the Oriental Orthodox understanding, and in the Henoticon agreement between us both and the current agreement today. They say Christ is 1, not 2. And intentionally, they don't say natures, because this is something that we haven't maybe hammered out, and this is what David was trying to talk about earlier, about us not, like, it's not clear enough, it's not explicit enough in agreements. I agree. But they intentionally are avoiding saying the word nature on there. They're just saying we both believe Christ is 1, and he's not 2. So no, I think 1 nature, if you mean mia nature, mia physis, that's okay. It doesn't, I don't see the problem.
All right, David?
So in regards to the Syriac mapping, first of all, I think you can have a degrees of linguistic flexibility, and even the Assyrian Church of the East has actually historically done that, even if they were not consistent in how those terms were used. If you look at the Peshitta, if you look at the Bible, for example, it doesn't actually correspond 1-to-1. It doesn't all the time. And I think 1 Peter 1:4, where it's mentioning that we partake in the divine nature, I don't think it presupposes that we're also partaking in the divine hypostasis, but rather we're partaking in the divine nature through the energies, right? So I think if you had that view in all cases in the Syriac, I think there will be some inconsistencies. But I will agree that in their terminological tradition, in your anti-Chalcedonian tradition understanding, I can understand how you taught that it will be the case, just like how it could be understandable that in our case, it was taught that Miaphysis was always heretical and all that. But I think in the case of Miaphysis, it's really because we accepted that we can be linguistically flexible. It wasn't something that was accepted naturally. It was something that our theologians looked at and they tried to understand how Saint Cyril used it. And primarily, even Antiochians, right? Those people, even they were linguistically flexible. And when Theodore of Cyrus, who wrote the formula, he changed Miaphysis to Mia hypostasis, and he said, if that's what you mean, then we're on the same page. And so it basically dives on that. I think the Syriac tradition can afford to do the same thing, and them not doing it is kind of like very worrying to me, in order to, how can this conversation move? And I think the Syrian Church of the East has actually done that development, linguistically speaking. So I think it is possible. It has been done, and it was there, I think. That's my thought.
So 30 seconds or less. I'm going to give this to Subdeacon Dan. How do the Oriental Orthodox identify an ecumenical council?
Okay. Before I answer this, I want to quickly answer the previous point. The Persian, I just want to say for Syriac purposes, the Persian church only does this in the late 5th century. You don't see it in Persian Syriac Christians before that. So it was only after Nestorianism that they began to use this in that way. Now, regarding this question, how OO distinguish and identify an ecumenical council? It's a good question. I think that it's not, in modern times, it's hard to know. There's different opinions now. Just like how in Eastern Orthodox, you have some people who say 7 and some people who say 9 and 8. Like liturgically, every Sunday we say in the Syriac Church, we believe in 3 ecumenical councils. Nicaea, Constantinople, and Ephesus. We list them by name. We know that after 449, though, Orientals believe in Nicaea, Ephesus, and Ephesus. And then in 475, they believed in Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Ephesus, and Ephesus. So it's not so clear, but today we know there's 3. Some people like to say when we say Ephesus, we mean all 3 of them. Some people like to say, no, it's only 431. Some people say, who cares what we're saying in the liturgy? We believe in the other 2 anyway. It's not so clear. We just know it's the faith handed down once for all. There's no like Pope or Vatican to tell us, just like you guys.
All right. So this is for something.
Craig, couldn't I respond? I thought I had that.
Authority, Oriental Orthodox view
from our perspective, right? Right. I mean, I just
Eastern Orthodox in 30 seconds.
Yeah. I just want to say, I will say, for example, I will reject that there are 7 ecumenical councils. I personally believe there are 9. I will include Constantinople 879 and the Palamite Synods. I think they're ecumenical. But I will also make this point clear. Not all dogmatic councils are ecumenical. I think there can be councils that are dogmatic, that the church accepts, that are not considered as that doesn't have to be an ecumenical council, as long as the entirety of the church universally accepts it, that it's antique and passes those criteria, it is accepted. So I think I will be more like flexible in that. So I don't think like...
We have other councils, like the Moldovan Synod in 1642, the Council of Dositheus, and they had all the members of what was left of the Pentarchy signing on to it. It's worth pointing out, though, like the question was, would there have been enough bishops? So you could argue, for example, with 879, 880, there was like 339 bishops, I think, in that council. That was representative of the Christian world at that time. But it's hard to argue for the Palamite Council.
Yeah, like how Florence was rejected by the Eastern Patriarchs in the Middle East, by all the 3 major patriarchs in the Middle East, and then it was condemned in 1484. Like, that's dogmatic. You can't say I accept Florence as an Orthodox, because you're anathema under those councils, right? Because the church accepts those councils. So that's an example that I want to give.
All right. So anyway, here I'll give both you guys try to answer this as quick as you can. How do you explain that Ilya Nisbis, or however you say it, an Nestorian bishop, uses 1 Kiana and 3 Pneuma for the Trinity in his dealings with Muslims? This clearly does not maintain a one-to-one mapping. All right, you guys have any opinions on that?
Yeah, so I want to make this very clear. Apparently, I've been understood. We do not equate Pneuma with Kiana. They are not the same. We say the Trinity, just like you had on the screen, we say the Trinity is 3 Pneuma, 1 Kiana. So, and David brought up the 2nd Peter verse with the partakers of the divine nature. Kiana does not mean hypostasis. So what it means being. So when it's saying partakers of the divine nature in the Syriac, it says a Kiana. It does not say Pneuma. So Kiana means being, not hypostasis. So we're partakers of the divine Kiana, not the divine Pneuma.
David?
Well, I think that response, like the question will, I mean, yeah, what they still, like, it's not equal, but at the same time, there's this popular phrase, like, if there's 1 Pneuma, there's 1 Kiana, or was it the other way around? I don't remember, but it has to be numerically equal. That kind of
No, we can't say that. We can't say that.
Okay, so for example, you can say 2 Pneuma was nature, right? Or was it hypostasis? I always mix the term.
Pneuma is hypostasis. Yeah.
So 2 Kiana, 1 Pneuma can basically be acceptable if you understand it as.
It can't, but not because of that. It can't, not because they have to be equal. It can't be accepted because Kiana means being. That's why it can't.
Right, but if you mean being by the substance of a being, then it can be accepted, can it not?
No, because it doesn't mean the substance of a being. It just means being. So you can't say Jesus is 2 beings, or in Jesus there are 2 beings. You can't say that. So this is why in the Nestorian, in the Assyrian Church of the East, they say Jesus is 2 Gnome and 2 Kiani. They say he's 2 hypostasis and 2 beings. So now they're adding in the Trinity, they're making them 4. Even they don't.
Yeah, quaternity. Yeah.
They don't say that we do that, but they are, because if the Trinity is 3 Gnome, so you can't put, and in Jesus himself there's 2 Gnome. So then you make them 4 now.
Yeah, I understand. I'm just basically saying, isn't there a possibility for linguistic flexibility?
They don't equal each other, but regarding the Christology, we say there's 1 and 1 because of the meaning.
So what's the difference between person and being then?
What's the difference between person and being? I would say.
What's the difference in the Syriac?
Yeah, I would say who you are And like, for example, God is one being, but he's three persons, right?
Right,
So
but
Jesus is one being and one person.
right, but what is that being exactly? Is it a substance? Is it something else? Like, what exactly is that? Like, what are we using being in the sense of?
In the sense of the one who was conceived, born of Mary, was tired, performed miracles, was hungry, walked on water. All of the things that he did, he is one in everything he does. It's the same
Yeah,
person.
but I'm talking about what being is. Like, what does it mean in the context of the Trinity, for example? Like, the one being, right? But what does being mean exactly?
So, like, for example, let's say God is one being. So actually say John of Damascus in the Chalcedonian church, John of Damascus talks about it because he's Middle Eastern. So he says, in his arguments against the Muslims, so God being one being is this, how the word of God is the logos, is the knowledge of God. So when he's talking to the Muslims, he's telling them, is there any time when the Father did not have a word or did not have a logic or his wisdom? Did he change outside of time? No. So then he always had, the one God always has his wisdom. And the same one God also has his own spirit. So his own word took flesh, his own logic, his logos took flesh. So this is the oneness of God. But there are
what distinguishes being with substance?
I'm going to be honest with you. In Syriac Christological terms, there's no word for substance. We borrow the Greek word.
Yeah,
there isn't one. There isn't an equivalent word. Like we borrow ousia. We don't have like even in the creed, when we say the creed, when we're saying one essence with his Father, we say ousia. Yeah.
All right, so to sum up the show, I want to give both of you guys 1 minute. I'm going to time it and cut your mic. You don't stick to it. It's getting late. What is your 1 minute case for why your position should be obvious and the other inexcusable? So I'll go with Deacon Daniel first.
So I think Christology should play a bigger role than I give it, because I think the way I think is very historical. And I think historically speaking, if we're going at purity of truth, and I'm not talking about Christological formulas, but I'm talking about who should be bishops and who should be deposed. I think it's clear that at Chalcedon, the wrong bishops were exonerated. Evidence of this is Constantinople 553. And at Ephesus 449 had already deposed those bishops that 553 agrees with eventually. And who cares about Eutyches? He's an archimandrite, doesn't matter. He died anyway. So, but Dioscoros, even in the view of the Chalcedonians, was Orthodox, as we see Anatolius himself declare at Chalcedon and the Chalcedonians after him. Dioscoros was Orthodox. So an Orthodox bishop should not be deposed, and heretical bishops should not be exonerated. Just on this fact, and things like a letter saying Cyril was Apollinarian in his 12 chapters being read at Chalcedon and not condemned until 100 years later it was condemned. That in itself is enough for me to say this council was not led by the Holy Spirit.
All right, we're past about a minute 30. David?
All right.
Okay, so the first thing I want to say, Dioscorus didn't even defend himself. He didn't attend the session where there were letters read. One of those letters that accused Dioscorus was from the nephew of Saint Cyril of Alexandria, and he himself said Dioscorus persecuted me. So I think when Saint Cyril's family member does that, I think it's kind of, and the fact that he didn't defend himself was an implicit admission from the bishops, basically, that he accepted what he basically accepts the charges, and he didn't even have a chance to be accused of being a heretic, because that defense he didn't even appear. But to the original question, I will ask a Christological question. So in our case, there's one divine person. He assumed an impersonal human nature. The human nature of Christ is the nature, the hypostasis of the human nature is the divine hypostasis, right? And whereas in the opposite view, instead of a union of those two natures, you have a union of two natures, but the nature means hypostasis. Now, the question I want to ask, that I asked in the debate, is if you have a union of two hypostases and a composite hypostasis out of two, then you have to ask, is this uncreated or is this created? Well, if it's created, then it's not divine. If it's uncreated, then it's not human. If it's both, then there are two hypostases after the union. Therefore, the position leads to Nestorianism. And I think, bearing that in mind and how the Christology is formulated, I think our Christology avoids that problem and the dilemmas that the Oriental position cannot answer, and that will be my case.
All right. You stuck to a minute, 30 seconds there, so both had equal time. Well, guys, I have to say I really do appreciate both your time this evening and doing this topic. It's definitely something worthy of a part two. I think we need to get into more issues, specifically of sessions 9 and 10 of Chalcedon, which is Eva's letter that keeps coming up. We also need to talk more detail about depositions, what makes for a canonical deposition. My very biased opinion is that when these things are fleshed out, the Eastern Orthodox case both disproves Oriental Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism because they misunderstand these things. But be that as it may, we have the opportunity, God willing, in the future for something in Daniel to prove us wrong on that point. But that's something where we didn't get to flesh out more tonight, and there's a lot there. There's a lot of people here like, oh, you know, prove the case doctrinally. But I think Subdeacon Daniel left a lot of things here about the historical case, which gives us more room to get into. So, guys, just my thanks for you guys coming on and doing great work as always.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
and
thank you, David.
And thank you, Subdeacon Daniel Kakish. If you're interested in seeing more of this stuff, my next part in History of Christian Theology is going to be about Severus of Antioch. And that's where my expertise is, basically. That's the best thing. That's the thing I'm best at in this issue. And if you're interested to see my theological breakdown of his Christology and his Tridology, I'll recommend checking that video. It's probably going to be the most detailed, the best part. And if you're not interested, then don't watch it, I guess, yeah. But if you're interested, yeah.
Please go to the Real Med White on YouTube, subscribe, and follow his stuff. I have to be honest, I don't follow a lot of stuff on YouTube. It's a big reason why I did Reason Theology. I thought everything sucked and wasn't worth my time. And I said, well, let me be part of something where I could actually be entertained. But the Real Med White meets that criteria for me. I think you do quality material, and I recommend everyone subscribe to it. Something, Daniel, what do you want to plug because you don't have a channel?
I'm going to be on Craig's show again tomorrow. So tune in.
We're going to plug Subdeacon Daniel. He's doing his Christian testimony tomorrow. There is some rumors that we might see his bunny. Don't know what's going to happen. But I really look forward to hearing about Subdeacon Daniel's testimony because you grew up, right, a evangelical, but ethnically, at least from your father's side, Eastern Orthodox, and you chose upon Oriental Orthodoxy. So I think in these things, people think this analytically, but we all have personal reasons for the decisions we've made. And somewhere along the way, we've also done kind of the more rational, historical sort of decisions. And it's interesting to see where that came out. So I really look forward to that tomorrow. For everyone else, you see in the bottom, as this show bless you, bless someone else. So depending on your communion, please support your local monastery because due to COVID, they have less pilgrims and they need your support and you need their prayers. So please support your local monastery and support old guys who are going out there making good content and blessing you. So everyone watching this, God bless you. Have a good evening and prepare your mind for church tomorrow. Thanks again.